She had appraised 312 vessels in 11 years, and she had never once been wrong about whether a boat had been sunk deliberately or accidentally. That was not arrogance, it was the specific competence of a woman who had learned to read the language of marine damage, the way other people read a sentence, the grammar of stress fractures and waterline markers, and the particular way a hull settled when it went down in controlled conditions versus the way it settled when the sea simply took it. Margaret Parrish had built that competence slowly and defended it consistently, and it had cost her 2 relationships and 1 friendship and a standing reputation in the Savannah maritime community as the woman you hired when you needed the truth and the woman you avoided when the truth was the problem. She was standing at the shallow end of that reputation on a Wednesday morning in April when she drove her truck across the Talmadge Memorial Bridge and came down into the Port District and parked at the Savannah River docks to look at what was left of the Leonora Blue. The Leonora Blue had been a working oyster dredge, 54 feet steel hull out of Thunderbolt Marina, and she had gone down 11 days ago in the Rummerly Marsh Creek system south of Taos North. The Coast Guard incident report called it a bilge pump failure on a vessel whose maintenance records were charitably incomplete. The owner, a man named Vernon Sills, who had been running oyster boats out of Savannah for 20 years, had drowned. His body had been found 2 days later on a sandbar near Skidaway Island. The insurance company had called Margaret at 7 in the morning and asked her to determine whether the sinking was consistent with the reported failure mode. She had said she would have a preliminary assessment within 48 hours. She had something else within 24. What she had was the specific sick certainty of a woman who read marine damage for a living and who was standing in front of a hull that did not match its own story. This is what the river carried back. This is what she found at the bottom of it, and the Coast Guard attorney who was already looking, and what it cost both of them to follow the evidence all the way to where it ended up. Stay for the ending. There's a reason the Savannah River runs the way it does, always moving, always carrying something you didn't know was in it until it surfaces downstream. The Leonora Blue had been raised by a salvage crew and was sitting on blocks at a commercial marine yard in Garden City, a working man's stretch of the waterfront that had none of Savannah's squares and Spanish moss, and all of its functional reality rusted equipment, in diesel smell, and the particular no-nonsense quality of a place that existed to work and had no patience for anything else. Margaret walked around the hull 3 times before she touched it. That was her practice, 3 full circuits, eyes only building the picture from the outside before you started contaminating the observation with hands. The crew at the yard had learned to leave her alone during the circuits. She had done work here enough times that they understood the rhythm. The exterior damage was consistent with a vessel that had gone down in a marsh creek and sat on the bottom for 11 days in low country tidal conditions. The silt staining the waterline markers, the soft tissue corrosion on the exposed metal at the watermark, all of it matched. Nothing wrong with the exterior. She went inside on the 4th pass. The engine room was where the claim said the failure had originated. Bilge pump, starboard aft. She crouched in the low space with her flashlight and looked at the pump housing, and the connections, and the condition of the surrounding structure, and she looked at those things for a long time without writing anything in her notebook. Then she straightened up and went to the wheelhouse and looked at the helm panel and the wiring access and the emergency stop systems. Then she went back to the bilge pump. A pump failure of the type described in the Coast Guard report would leave specific evidence the impeller housing would show stress fracture patterns consistent with running dry against a blocked intake, or it would show the electrical burn signatures of a motor failure under load, or it would show the physical deformation of a pump that had been overwhelmed by water ingress beyond its rated capacity. One of those 3 patterns depending on the failure mode. The pump showed none of them. The pump showed a clean disconnection at the discharge coupling. Not a failure or disconnection. The coupling bolts had been removed. Not corrosion loosened, not vibration walked, not sheared by stress. Removed. The thread pattern on the exposed bolt holes was clean the way thread patterns were clean when something was taken apart deliberately rather than failed apart under load. Margaret sat on the engine room floor for a while with that information. Vernon Sills had been 61 years old. He had 3 daughters, one of whom had called Margaret's office 4 days after the sinking, before the insurance company had even retained her, to say that her father had not sunk that boat, that he would not have let the Leonora Blue get into the kind of condition the Coast Guard report described, that something was wrong. Margaret had listened to that call with the professional neutrality she brought to all calls before she had evidence one way or the other. The professional neutrality had now been replaced by something considerably less neutral. She called the insurance company and told them she needed 72 additional hours. Then she sat in the engine room of the Leonora Blue and looked at the clean thread on those bolt holes and thought about a 61-year-old man who knew his boat the way she knew hull damage and what it meant that his boat had been taken apart. Savannah kept its secrets the way old cities kept everything layered unhurried, the new grown over the old, until they were indistinguishable. Margaret had lived here for 7 years, long enough to know the river and the squares and the particular way the city changed texture as you moved away from the tourist district toward the working waterfront where the boats were tools and the docks smelled of fuel and diesel and salt, and nobody was prettying anything up for anyone. She had an office above a maritime equipment supplier on Factor's Walk, the cobblestone row along the river bluff. The stairs were steep and the windows were original 1850s glass that made the world outside look slightly bent, which she had decided on day one was appropriate for the business she was in. She had been in enough insurance disputes to know that the world was always slightly bent from one perspective or another, and the job was to find the view from which it was actually straight. She spent the night after the Leonora Blue examination going through everything she had: the Coast Guard incident report, the vessel's insurance file, the maintenance records the insurer had pulled, and what she could find about Vernon Sills from the Savannah Maritime Community records. Vernon Sills had been in the oyster business since he was 22. He had owned 4 boats in that time, the Leonora Blue being the most recent, purchased 8 years ago. His maintenance records, the actual records, not the incomplete ones the Coast Guard report had referenced, were in the Thunderbolt Marina office, and she had a call in to the marina manager. His insurance policy had been increased 14 months before his death from $110,000 to $185,000. The increase had been approved without inspection, which was unusual for a working vessel of the Leonora Blue's age and type. The policy was held through a company called Coastal Heritage Marine Insurance, underwritten through a reinsurance partner called Tidewater Guarantee Group. She wrote down that name. It was the 3rd time in 6 months she had seen Tidewater Guarantee Group's name on a policy connected to a vessel that had sunk under questionable circumstances. The first had been a crab boat out of Darien 4 months ago. The owner had survived, the boat had not, and the claim had been paid without investigation. Margaret had not been retained on that one. She knew about it because the Darien owner had called her before the insurance company did, trying to figure out what had happened to his boat. She had told him she wasn't retained and couldn't help, and she had written Tidewater Guarantee Group in her notebook and left it there. The second had been a shrimp trawler out of Brunswick 2 months ago. The captain was an older woman named Della Price who had been shrimping those waters for 30 years. Her boat had gone down in the Sound on a calm night. She had survived. The insurance claim was in dispute and the company had not yet retained an appraiser. The third was the Leonora Blue, and Vernon Sills had not survived. 3 vessels in 6 months, all insured through the same reinsurance partner, all sunk in circumstances that generated claims, 2 of the 3, in conditions that did not match the reported failure modes. Margaret had been doing this work for 11 years, and she trusted the accumulation of pattern in the way that she trusted the evidence in a hull. The pattern was telling her something. She called her contact at the National Insurance Crime Bureau at 7:30 in the morning. "Tidewater Guarantee Group," she said. "What do you have?" A pause. "Where did you come across that name?" 3 vessels in 6 months, Savannah-Brunswick corridor. 2 of them I have concerns about the failure mode." Another pause longer. "Margaret, send me what you have by secure email. Don't make any more calls about this from your regular line." He paused. "There's an investigation. I can't tell you more than that from this end." She looked out her 1850s glass window at the bent version of the Savannah River. "Federal. Send me what you have," he said, and ended the call. The marina manager at Thunderbolt called back at 9. His name was Oscar Belk, and he had been managing the marina for 14 years and had the particular matter-of-fact quality of a man who had seen enough of the waterfront to be unsurprised by almost anything except bad seamanship, which he did not forgive. "Vernon was meticulous," he said when she asked about the maintenance records. "I mean that specifically. He kept a handwritten log in addition to the formal records, a captain's log for mechanical work, which is old-fashioned but consistent with the way he operated. Every oil change, every pump inspection, every through-hull check. He did a full inspection of the bilge system himself every 6 weeks. The Coast Guard report characterized the maintenance as incomplete." Oscar made a sound that was not quite a word. The Coast Guard report was based on the digital maintenance records filed with the insurer. Those records are incomplete because Vernon didn't trust digital systems and filed the minimum required. The actual records are in a binder that he kept on the boat. He paused. The binder was not on the boat when she went down. His daughter has it. Margaret wrote that down carefully. Which daughter? Adele, the middle one. She came to the marina the morning after Vernon went missing before the Coast Guard had even called it. She knew something was wrong because he hadn't come home and he always called when he was running late. She went through the boat locker before the Coast Guard sealed everything and took the binder. Why would she take the binder before the Coast Guard arrived? Oscar was quiet for a moment. Because Vernon had called her the night before he went out and told her if anything happened to get the binder before anyone else did. He paused. That's what she told me. I don't know what that tells you, but it tells me something. It told Margaret something too. She called Daniel Sills at 10 o'clock. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and Margaret left a careful, factual message. She was a marine appraiser retained to investigate the circumstances of the Leonora Blue's sinking. She had questions that might be important. She would like to meet at Adele's convenience. Adele called back in 40 minutes. I've been waiting for someone to call, she said. Her voice was controlled in the way of a person managing a great deal and doing it through sheer organization. I didn't know who to call myself. I didn't know if what I had was... She stopped. Can you come today? Tell me where, Margaret said. Daniel Sills lived in a small house on Whitmarsh Island, 20 minutes east of Savannah across the marshes. She was 34, a physical therapist, with her father's direct eyes and the particular composure of a woman who had been the practical one in her family since she was old enough to be practical. She opened the door before Margaret reached the porch, which meant she had been watching the driveway. She sat Margaret at her kitchen table and put coffee between them, and sat down herself with her hands wrapped around her own cup, and she looked at Margaret with the assessment of someone deciding whether to trust. He called me the night before he went out, Adele said. He'd been calling every few nights for the past month. Not like him, he wasn't a phone person. But he'd been calling because he was worried. About what? About what he'd gotten into. She looked at her coffee. He'd been approached 4 months ago by a man who said he ran a maritime logistics company. The man said he needed independent vessel operators for a research and survey project in the offshore waters south of the Golden Isles. Legitimate work, he said, permitted. Good money, twice what my father made in an average week. Margaret kept her face level. Did he take the job? For 3 months. He said it was strange he'd pick up equipment canisters from a specific dock on the Little Ogeechee River, go to coordinates. He was given lower the canisters down with the dredge equipment, come back. He thought it was ocean floor sampling equipment. Environmental research, the man had said. Adele's jaw tightened. He asked questions eventually. He was given answers that didn't hold up. He started looking at what the canisters actually were. Margaret waited. They were pumps, Adele said. Water evacuation pumps. High-volume industrial pumps. The kind you would use if you needed to clear water out of an enclosed space. She looked at the table. He went back to the coordinates on his own without being hired to on a day when no one was at the site. He went down with a dive mask. He wasn't a diver, but he could free dive to about 20 feet. He said there was a wreck down there, an old one, and whatever they were pumping out was coming from the wreck. The specific quality of the information clicked into place in Margaret's professional understanding. Industrial evacuation pumps lowered to depth. A wreck. She thought about what you would evacuate water from inside an underwater wreck for the reasons that were legitimate, the reasons that were not. Did he tell you what was in the wreck? She said. He didn't know exactly. He said there were containers inside it, sealed containers. He said it looked like the pumps were being used to clear visibility inside the wreck so someone could work in it. He said, she stopped. He said the wreck was very old. He said it looked like a 19th century vessel. He said there were things in it that did not look like ordinary cargo. Margaret looked at her hands on the table. He went to the man who hired him and said he wanted out, Adele said. He said the man was calm about it. Said fine, the project was wrapping up anyway. Said there was a severance payment, no hard feelings. She paused. That was 3 weeks before he went out that last night. And then someone disconnected the discharge coupling on his bilge pump, Margaret said. Adele looked at her steadily. You found that? Yes. The Coast Guard report doesn't say that. The Coast Guard report characterizes it as a maintenance failure. I'm saying the physical evidence of the pump does not support that characterization. She met Adele's eyes. What's in the binder, Adele? Adele got up and walked to the back of the house. She came back with a 3-ring binder, well-worn, the cover carrying the water stains of a boat that lived on the water. She set it on the table. Everything, she said. Every inspection, every coordinate he was given. He wrote them all down. He wrote down the dates and the times and the descriptions of the canisters and the description of what he saw in the freedive. She paused. He also wrote down the name of the man who hired him. I need to make a call before we open this, Margaret said. Adele looked at her. Why? Because if there's evidence in that binder, it needs to be handled in a way that doesn't damage any existing investigation. She took out her phone. And because my NICB contact told me this morning that there is an existing investigation and whoever's running it needs to know about this before I open that binder and potentially move something. She called her NICB contact and got voicemail. She left a message with the essential facts. Whitmarsh Island, the binder, the bilge pump finding, and ended the call. She sat for a moment thinking. Her NICB contact had said, don't make more calls from your regular line. He had said there was an investigation he couldn't speak to. He had said send what you have by secure email. He had not given her a name or a number. She called the Coast Guard Investigative Services public line and asked to speak with whoever was handling the Vernon Sills case. She was transferred twice and then told that the case had been designated as a joint investigation with another federal agency, and the contact point was a commander's office at the 8th District. She asked for the name of the investigative attorney. After a pause, she was given a name, Daniel Frey. Investigative Counsel, Coast Guard Maritime Law Enforcement Division. She called the number. He picked up on the third ring. Daniel Frey. Direct, not unfriendly, the voice of a person who answered phones as a matter of professional obligation and not performance. My name is Margaret Parrish. I'm a marine salvage appraiser in Savannah. I've been retained by the insurer to evaluate the Leonora Blue sinking, and I've found physical evidence that the reported failure mode is inconsistent with the actual pump condition. She said it precisely. I'm also sitting in the home of Vernon Sills' daughter, who has a binder of operational records that her father kept, including coordinates and observations from work he was paid to do in the weeks before he died. I haven't opened the binder yet. I'm calling you before I open it. A silence. Not long, he processed quickly. Why are you calling me before you open it? He said. Because someone told me this morning that there's a federal investigation and I didn't want to move something you're relying on. She paused. And because Vernon Sills' pump was deliberately disconnected and his daughter needs someone to give a specific kind of damn about that. Another silence, this one with a different quality. We're on Whitmarsh Island, he said. Daniel Frey arrived in 55 minutes, which meant he had driven from somewhere in the Brunswick or Savannah area rather than from somewhere further. He was in a dark gray jacket, no uniform and ID badge at his belt that she registered, and he did not flash. He was tall and broad-shouldered, built like someone who had spent a meaningful amount of time in physical work before sitting at a desk, and he had the particular focused stillness of a person who arrived in complicated situations already organized. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Adele Sills with the quality of directness she would come to recognize as simply how he operated. Not performance, not managed sympathy, but the genuine attention of someone fully in the room. Ms. Sills, he said, your father found something he shouldn't have found, and he made a decision about what to do with it. I want you to know that decision was the right one, even though the outcome was not. Adele looked at him. You already know what he found. We know pieces of it. He glanced at the binder. We don't know what's in there. May I? He put on nitrile gloves he'd brought them, which told Margaret something, and opened the binder. Vernon Sills had been systematic in a way that was its own kind of character portrait. The entries were in a crabbed, careful handwriting, logged in the format of someone who had kept vessel maintenance records his whole life, date time, weather coordinates observations. 3 months of entries beginning with the first day the man from the logistics company had hired him and running through to the day before he died. The coordinates in the early entries were different from the coordinates in the later ones. The early entries described the pickup dock on the Little Ogeechee, the equipment canisters, the lowering work. The later entries beginning around 6 weeks in described something else. Vernon had started going back to the coordinates on his own, on his days off, free diving to 20 feet, with a waterproof notepad describing what he saw below. The descriptions were careful and methodical, and they were damning. An uncharted wreck at 65 feet in a designated protected marine area 8 miles offshore. The wreck of what appeared from the visible structural elements to be a wooden vessel of significant age. Activity around and inside the wreck. At times Vernon could see lights in the water below him, indicating divers working in the wreck. The evacuation pumps on 3 separate occasions operating continuously for periods of up to 6 hours. And on the last entry before the confrontation with the man who had hired him, A description brief and precise of a container being brought up from the wreck, sealed and labeled, loaded onto a vessel. He described as a 40-foot sport fisher with a name he had partially read, Ridge Runner. Daniel Frey went very still when he read that entry. Margaret, who was reading across the table from him, saw it. "You know that boat," she said. "I know the name." He read the entry again. "Give me a moment." He read through the rest of the binder without speaking. His expression was controlled in the way of a person organizing complex information in real time. Not emotion, not performance, just the working face of someone doing difficult cognitive work quickly. When he finished, he looked at Adele. "Do you know if your father took any photographs?" "His phone." Adele straightened. "He had a waterproof case for his phone. He took it when he dove." "The phone was on the Leonora Blue when she went down." She paused. "The salvage crew inventoried the recovered items. Was the phone on the list?" Margaret had the Coast Guard incident report in her bag. She took it out and found the recovered property inventory. "Phone waterproof case serial number listed." She looked at Daniel. "It's in Coast Guard custody." "It was photographed as recovered property and placed in evidence storage 3 days ago." He looked at Adele. "If your father used the camera in that case, the images may still be on the phone. Waterproof cases are genuinely waterproof at those depths, if they're in good repair." "His cases were always in good repair," Adele said. Daniel stood. He looked at Margaret. "I need to be back in Savannah this afternoon. Can we meet?" "My office is on Factors Walk," she said. "Above Harmon Maritime Supply. The stairs are on the riverside." "What time?" 4 o'clock. He looked at Adele. "Ms. Sills, this binder needs to go into federal evidence. I want to give you a complete receipt for every item in it, and I want you to know that it will be used exactly the way your father intended it to be used to make the people responsible for what happened to him accountable." Adele looked at him for a long moment. "Are you able to actually do that?" "I am going to do everything in my capacity to do that," he said. "That's the most honest answer I can give you." She looked at Margaret. Margaret had been watching Daniel Frey for the past 2 hours, and she had been making the assessment she always made, not whether someone was likable, but whether they were the person they were presenting as. Whether the way they moved through the room matched the words they used to describe what they intended. It matched. "Yes," she said, "he will." Adele said, "Take it." Margaret's Factors Walk office had the particular quality of her own discipline written into the physical space files in specific order. Evidence photographs on the far wall arranged by case. The 2 good chairs and the desk that was from the original building and was not going anywhere because it was too large to remove without taking out a wall. She had a coffee maker on the credenza, and she put it on when she got back at 3:30, and Daniel Frey arrived at 3:58. He sat in one of the good chairs without being asked. He had the binder with him already bagged for evidence, and a folder she hadn't seen before. "The Ridge Runner," he said. "It's a 42-foot sport fisher registered in Georgia waters to a company called Coastal Meridian Marine Holdings, LLC." He looked at her steadily. "Coastal Meridian Marine Holdings is a subsidiary entity of Tidewater Guarantee Group." Margaret looked at him. "The reinsurance partner. You know that name. I've seen it on 3 policies in 6 months. All 3 vessels sunk in the Savannah-Brunswick corridor. All 3 under circumstances that raise questions." She paused. "Is that part of your investigation?" "It is now." He opened the folder. 6 weeks ago, the investigation was focused on the wreck site and the unauthorized salvage activity. The vessel insurance piece was not yet in the picture. He looked at the folder. "You just put it in the picture." She looked at him. He was in his mid-40s, she estimated, with the particular weathering of someone who had spent significant time at sea before moving into an office. Not decorative weathering, the kind that came from the cumulative exposure of actual maritime work. His hands were still a working man's hands, she noticed, which was the kind of detail she cataloged without deciding to. "What's at the wreck site?" she said. He looked at her carefully. "What I can share with you today in your capacity as a material witness to this investigation, the wreck is a pre-Civil War vessel currently under protected status by the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. It was identified from historical records 18 months ago as potentially being the wreck of a vessel that went down in 1857 carrying cargo from coastal Georgia ports." "What kind of cargo?" He was quiet for a moment. "The historical record on the specific vessel is incomplete. What the archaeology team that identified it believes, based on the external evidence and archival sources, is that the vessel was transporting goods from a coastal plantation operation that ceased to exist in 1858 under circumstances that are not fully documented." He paused. One of the archival sources is a plantation inventory from 1857 that lists personal property belonging to enslaved workers at the plantation. Some of those items are described in detail. Margaret sat with that for a moment. And Tidewater Guarantee Group has been pulling those items from the wreck. That is the working conclusion, yes. He said it carefully with the manner of a man who had been in federal investigations long enough to distinguish between conclusions that were established and conclusions that were probable. The evacuation pump activity Vernon Sills documented is consistent with clearing the interior of a sealed cargo hold for access. The containers he described being brought to the surface are consistent with the size and handling requirements for the type of objects we believe are in that hold. Who's buying them? That's the part we don't have yet. The distribution network is sophisticated. The objects are being cleaned of provenance and sold into the private collector market, likely with fabricated documentation, placing them in a different historical context. He looked at the folder. Vernon Sills documented the operation for 3 months. The photographs on his phone, if they survive, may give us what we don't have. His phone is in evidence storage. I'm having it sent to the forensic imaging unit tonight. We'll know by tomorrow morning. Margaret looked out of the bent glass window at the river. It was late afternoon, the light going golden over the water, the way Savannah light did when the day was deciding to become an evening, the city's best trick, that particular late light, which it performed without effort or awareness of performing. 3 vessels, she said, in 6 months. If Tidewater Guarantee Group is the reinsurance partner on all 3, they're creating the claims to generate revenue that obscures the income from the salvage operation, he said. The insurance fraud is the financial infrastructure. The unauthorized salvage is what the infrastructure is protecting. He paused. We suspected the fraud. We hadn't connected it to specific vessels until you walked into this conversation this afternoon. What do you need from me? Your formal statement about the Leonora Blue pump finding, your documentation of the other 2 vessels and the Tidewater connection. And, he paused, I need you to not contact Coastal Meridian Marine Holdings or Tidewater Guarantee Group and not complete or file your insurance assessment for the Leonora Blue until I tell you the timing is right. I'd already decided that. She looked at him. The assessment would create a paper event that might tell the wrong people something is moving. He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, more like recalibration. Yes, that's exactly right. I've been doing this for 11 years, she said. I know what moves evidence in the wrong direction. I can see that. He was quiet. Margaret, she looked at him. The man who hired Vernon Sills, his name was Gerald Hewitt. He's a mid-level operations manager for Coastal Meridian Marine Holdings. He said it carefully. He's not the principal. He's the hand that does the hiring. The principal is a man named Carter Aldis, who is the managing partner of Tidewater Guarantee Group and who has been operating in the southeastern maritime insurance and logistics sector for 12 years. He paused. Vernon confronted Hewitt. Hewitt told Aldis. The decision about Vernon Sills was made at that level. She held that. Vernon Sills was not a threat to them if they'd left him alone, Daniel said. He had bowed out quietly. He'd asked no questions after the confrontation. He'd stopped going to the coordinates. He looked at the bag binder. But they couldn't know what he might have documented or who he might eventually talk to, and they were in an active phase of the operation. The main extraction based on the pump activity timeline was in its final stage. They couldn't afford a variable. So they removed the variable, Margaret said. They tried to make it look like a maintenance failure on an older vessel with incomplete digital records. His jaw was set. If you hadn't found the pump condition, and if Adele Sills hadn't kept that binder, it would have looked like exactly what they wanted it to look like. Margaret thought about Adele watching the driveway, about a father who called his daughter the night before he went out and told her what to take if something happened, about a man who had been on the water his whole life and who had understood in the final weeks of it that he was carrying something that was going to outlast him and had made provisions for it accordingly. Vernon Sills was not a complicated man, she said. It was her own version of an observation she'd seen arrive at the same place in different cases across 11 years. He was a working man who found something wrong and made a specific decision about it. Yes, Daniel said. He planned for the possibility that he wouldn't survive the decision. He did. Then the plan worked. She looked at the river. He told Adele. Adele told me. I called you. The binder is in evidence. Whatever's on that phone is going to be in evidence. She paused. The plan worked. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Outside the bent glass, the Savannah River was doing what rivers do at the end of a long day, wide and slow and completely itself carrying what it carried toward the sea. Yes, he said, it did. He left at 6 o'clock with her preliminary statement signed and the commitment to be in contact in the morning. She stayed at the desk after he left and looked at the river through the 1850s glass and thought about 3 vessels in 6 months and a reinsurance company that was in the business of making evidence disappear and the specific quality of competence that it took to recognize what they were doing before they had finished doing it. She had recognized it. That was the job. She turned off the desk lamp and went home. Damn! Home was a second-floor apartment on Jones Street in the residential grid of the historic district with a porch that looked over one of the neighborhood's private gardens and produced in her at the end of every long workday the specific quiet she had learned to need. She had lived in Savannah for 7 years and had not intended to stay this long. She had come for a 2-year contract with a marine appraisal firm, and the city had kept her the way cities did when they were the right fit gradually without announcement, until one day you looked around and realized you had bought furniture. She made dinner and ate it at the porch table in the April evening and thought about the Leonora Blue and Vernon Sills and the binder and Daniel Frey. She thought about the Ridge Runner and Coastal Meridian Marine Holdings and Tidewater Guarantee Group and the geometry of a fraud that used insurance claims as financial camouflage for something considerably worse than fraud. She thought about a wreck at 65 feet in a protected marine area and what Tidewater Guarantee Group had been pulling out of it, and the 1857 plantation inventory and whose things those had been. Some losses were not accidents. Some losses were decisions made by people who had calculated that they could make them without consequence. The work that Margaret had spent 11 years doing was in part the work of making those calculations wrong, of being the person who looked at what the hull told her and followed the implication no matter where it led. She had followed this one to the doorstep of a federal investigation, which was further than most of her cases went, and she was not inclined to stop following it now. Her phone rang at 9 o'clock. Daniel Frey. The phone survived, he said. 34 images. The forensic unit has confirmed they're recoverable. She closed her eyes for a moment. What do they show? I haven't seen them yet. The unit is processing them tonight. I'll have them in the morning. But the tech confirmed that at least some of the images are of an underwater site. A pause. He said based on a preliminary look at the first few frames that the structural elements visible are consistent with a mid-19th century wooden vessel. Vernon was freediving to 20 feet. He got inside the wreck. Apparently. She could hear something in his voice, not drama. Nothing performed but the specific quality of a person who had been building towards something for a long time and could feel it beginning to hold. Margaret. Yes. The name in the binder, the logistics company, the man who hired Vernon, the documentation Vernon kept is going to be sufficient for the warrant applications. I'm filing those tonight. He paused. The investigation is moving into its final phase, which means the people we're looking at are going to become aware of it possibly within the next 48 hours. She understood what that meant. You're telling me to be careful. Vernon Sills was careful, he said. I don't want to revisit that conversation. She looked at the garden below her porch. The evening was quiet, the Jones Street neighborhood doing its residential thing, a dog walking a couple on the sidewalk, a porch light going on across the garden. Normal. Entirely normal in the way that made the other thing, the Leonora Blue, and the disconnected pump and the wreck at 65 feet feel like a different universe. It was not a different universe. It was the same one. I'll be careful, she said. Call me when you have the photographs. She went to bed at 10 and lay in the dark and listened to the Jones Street sounds. The city settling into its evening, the distant sound of the river somewhere always somewhere, the particular live water quality of a port city that never entirely went quiet. She thought about the Leonora Blue on the bottom of the Romerly Marsh Creek, the deliberate hand that had disconnected the coupling, the cold math of it. She thought about Adele Sills watching the driveway. She thought about a man who had called his daughter the night before he went out and told her what to take. She thought about what it cost to be the kind of person who made that call. In the morning, she was going to make sure it was worth the cost. The photographs were everything. Daniel called at 7:40 in the morning. Margaret was already at her desk with coffee she had not tasted, having spent the prior 2 hours rebuilding the timeline of Tidewater Guarantee Group's activity in the Savannah-Brunswick corridor against the dates in Vernon Sills' binder, and the map on her office wall was beginning to look like what it actually was. Not a series of separate incidents, but a single operation with a financial infrastructure carefully constructed to survive scrutiny. 34 images, Daniel said. 22 of them are underwater. The wreck site from roughly 15 to 20 feet down, shot through the waterproof case with a phone camera, not ideal optics, but clear enough. A pause. Margaret, he documented the interior. He got inside. He squeezed through a gap in the hull plating on the port side amidships. There's a sequence of 12 photographs from inside the cargo hold. Another pause, and in the pause she could hear him organizing what he was about to say. The hold was partially cleared. The pump activity he documented corresponded to this. They had evacuated the silt to access what was underneath. What was underneath was a layer of material that Vernon's photographs show clearly enough to be identified. What was underneath, she said. Personal effects. Clothing partially preserved. Personal items, combs, shoes, objects of the type that would be carried by a person as daily necessities. The forensic archaeology team that I contacted last night, based on the binder information, has reviewed 3 of the images I sent them early this morning, and they confirmed the hold is consistent with the transportation of people, not cargo in the commercial sense. He said it carefully. The 1857 vessel appears to have been carrying enslaved people at the time it went down. Margaret looked at the river through her window. The morning light was doing its early thing over the water, the long, flat light that preceded the fuller warmth of day, the kind of light that made the river look like something that had been there since before the city. And Tidewater Guarantee Group has been extracting those items, she said, for at least 8 months based on the pump activity timeline. The items appear to be sold into the private market through a network of dealers who specialize in what they call pre-Civil War maritime artifacts, with provenance documentation that misattributes them to legitimate salvage sites. His voice was controlled and precise, and underneath it, in the careful organization of a person who had been working toward accountability for a long time, something that was not precisely anger, but was adjacent to it. The communities that are the direct descendants of the people on that vessel have been trying to have the site formally protected for 3 years. The Georgia DNR recognized it as potentially protected 18 months ago, but the formal designation process takes time. That time is what Tidewater used. They knew the designation window was closing. The formal protection designation was expected to come through within the next 4 to 6 months. They were in the final extraction phase. Vernon Sills stumbled into the last stage of the operation, and they calculated they couldn't afford to leave him as a variable. He paused. One more thing. The last 4 photographs in the sequence, the final images Vernon took before he surfaced on that last solo dive show, the Ridge Runner overhead. You can see the hull from below the surface, and in one of them you can see a person at the stern looking down into the water. Looking for him, looking at the dive site. Whether they saw him is not clear from the photograph, but someone was on that boat and looking at the water where Vernon was below. He was quiet for a moment. He surfaced, got back to the Leonora Blue, and went home. He called Adele that evening. He went out on his last trip 4 days later, the 4 days between. She thought about what Vernon Sills had done in those 4 days, whether he had known they had seen him, whether he had weighed the risk and made his decision anyway, whether the call to Adele about the binder was the signal that he had understood what he was up against. She thought about what it meant to be 61 years old and know the water the way he knew it, and to get back into your boat and go home and make a phone call and keep going. The warrant applications, she said, filed at 8 a.m., Judge Holloway's office, Federal District. I expect we'll have them within 24 hours. He paused. In the meantime, I need your formal statement about the Tidewater reinsurance pattern, the 3 vessels, the policy structures, the anomalies you noted. I know I asked for it yesterday, and we ran out of time. I can come to your office this morning. I'm not at an office in Savannah. I operate out of the Brunswick sector office, but I've been working this case from a field position here this week. There's a conference room at the Federal Building on Bay Street. He paused. 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock, she said. The Federal Building on Bay Street had the institutional solidity of mid-century government architecture, the kind of building that presented the same face regardless of what was happening inside it. Margaret was logged through security and escorted to a conference room on the 2nd floor, where Daniel Frey was already at the table with a recording device and a junior colleague named Petra Haas, who was 28 and efficient and had the focused competence of someone who had been doing important work long enough to take it seriously without needing to perform the seriousness. Margaret gave her statement over 90 minutes. She described the Leonora Blue engagement and the pump finding the NICB call and the Tidewater pattern. The sequence of events at Whitmarsh Island, the binder and the 3 vessels in 6 months, she had identified as connected through the Tidewater Reinsurance Partnership. She was precise and complete, and she did not editorialize. She had given enough formal statements to know that precision was its own kind of argument. When she was done, Daniel said, "You said 3 vessels. I'm going to need the details on the other 2. The crab boat out of Darien 4 months ago, the Amber Sound. Owner is Tommy Kress, who survived. The boat sank on a calm night, claim was paid without physical inspection. I wasn't retained." She paused. "The shrimp trawler out of Brunswick 2 months ago. The Della Blue. Owner is Della Price, who survived. The claim is in dispute. Coastal Meridian Marine Holdings underwrote the hull coverage on both." Petra was writing this down. Daniel looked at the table for a moment in the way he apparently used for processing complex information, not hesitating, organizing. "Della Price," he said. "Has anyone from the insurance company contacted her recently?" "I don't know. I don't have a relationship with her." Margaret paused. "Do you know her?" "I know of her. She's been shrimping the Brunswick coastal waters for 30 years. She reported the sinking to the Coast Guard as a bilge pump failure, which is now—" He stopped. "Interesting. Same failure mode as the Leonora Blue." "Same failure mode." He looked at Petra. "Get Della Price's contact information from the Marine Safety Unit and reach out today. Don't tell her what we're working on. Just say we have some follow-up questions on the incident report and ask if she's available for a meeting." Petra nodded and left. Daniel turned back to Margaret. "Tommy Kress," he said. "I can get you his contact information from the Marine Community Network. He's known in the Darien area. Oscar Belk at Thunderbolt Marina might have it. Get it to me today." He looked at her steadily. "The pattern you identified, 3 vessels, same reinsurance partner, same failure mode characterization in at least 2 of the 3. That's the insurance fraud infrastructure I described last night. But the other 2 boats, if they match the Leonora Blue pattern, suggest that Tidewater was running a broader test of the mechanism before they used it on Vernon." Margaret thought about that. They needed to know if a pump disconnection would pass as a maintenance failure. They needed to know if anyone would look closely enough to find the difference. The Amber Sound claim was paid without inspection, so no one looked. The Della Blue claim is in dispute, but on financial grounds, not mechanical ones, so the failure mode went unexamined. He paused. The Leonora Blue was the 3rd attempt. Vernon was a specific threat. He'd seen the operation. The first 2 boats may have been people who got too close, or may have been purely financial, or both. We don't know yet. "Tommy Kress and Della Price," Margaret said. "We need to know what they were involved in." "We do." He looked at his folder. "The warrants, when they come, are for Gerald Hewitt and Carter Aldis. Hewitt is the operations manager. He ran the hiring of Vernon Sills and the coordination of the pump operation. Aldis is the principal of Tidewater Guarantee Group and the architect of the insurance fraud structure." He paused. "Aldis has no obvious connection to the physical operation at the wreck site. There's likely a 3rd layer, someone who ran the actual extraction that we haven't identified yet." "The dive operation," Margaret said. "Someone was organizing the divers. The Ridge Runner was their boat, but someone was coordinating who went in the water." "Yes." He looked at the table. "The person at the stern in Vernon's last photograph. If we can identify them, the photograph will be at the right resolution. The forensic team is enhancing it. We'll know today." He closed his folder. "Margaret, I want to tell you something about the scope of this before the warrants execute, and you're potentially in a different position." She looked at him. He met her eyes. "Carter Aldis is connected to 3 named individuals in the southeastern maritime sector who have been investigated by federal authorities at various points in the past 8 years and have not been successfully prosecuted. Not because they weren't doing what investigators believed they were doing, but because the evidence chains were broken before they could be completed." He said it evenly. He is experienced at watching investigations and understanding exactly how much evidence needs to disappear to prevent a prosecution. "You're telling me the 3 vessels aren't the beginning of this. I'm telling you that Tidewater Guarantee Group is the 4th iteration of a structure that Carter Aldis has built and dismantled twice before in other jurisdictions." He paused. "The first 2 times the key witnesses stopped cooperating. One of them moved out of state unexpectedly. One of them had a boating accident." Margaret did not move. She absorbed what he was saying, the particular chill of it, the calculation it implied. "I want you to know what you're in the middle of," he said, "so that you can make informed decisions about how you operate in the next 48 hours. "How do I operate?" she said. "Carefully." He held her gaze. "Not with fear, carefully. There's a difference. Carefully means go where you've said you'll go, let someone know your movements, don't take meetings with numbers you don't recognize, and call me if anything feels wrong. He paused. It also means keep doing the work. The case needs you to keep doing the work. I'll keep doing the work, she said. He looked at her for a moment with the quality of assessment she had noticed the first time he sat at Adele Sills's kitchen table, the genuine sort not performed calibrating something real. I know you will, he said. She went to the Garden City Marine Yard after the meeting and did something she had not done on her first examination. She photographed the entire pump housing in the systematic documentation format used for federal evidence, and she sent the photographs to the secure email address Daniel had given her. Then she walked around the Leonora Blue 3 more times and looked at her the way she looked at boats, not with the insurance appraiser's eye looking for the failure mode, but with the fuller attention of someone who understood that a boat was not just a claim file. It was a person's working life, the tool through which they understood their place in the world, the thing they trusted. The Leonora Blue had been Vernon Sills' working life for 8 years. He had maintained her with more care than the digital records reflected. He had taken her to coordinates he did not know were wrong, and when he understood they were wrong, he had made a decision, and that decision had cost him everything. She was standing at the bow looking at the Leonora Blue's waterline when her phone rang. Her NICB contact. I got your message from yesterday, he said, and I've been in contact with the investigators this morning. You're already in the conversation. He paused. The people running this Aldous, specifically, they have eyes in a lot of places. Be careful who you talk to about this and where. Daniel Frey said the same thing. Daniel Frey is right. A pause. You found the pump, Margaret. I don't think they know that, yet the insurance company's internal communications haven't reflected that anyone found anything out of the ordinary. But they'll know soon that the federal warrants are coming, and when they know that, they'll start identifying who generated the evidence that made the warrants possible. They'll figure out it was me. When it gets to that point, yes, probably within 48 hours after the warrants execute. He paused. You're not in danger right now. You are in a situation that will require you to stay aware. She looked at the Leonora Blue. I've been staying aware for 11 years, she said. I'll manage. She drove back across town to Factor's Walk and climbed the steep stairs and sat at her desk and worked through the afternoon on the formal documentation package for the federal case. The detailed physical findings on the pump, the 3-vessel tidewater pattern, the policy structure analysis that showed how the reinsurance mechanism generated claim payouts without generating scrutiny of the underlying operations. It was intricate, and she was meticulous about it because intricate cases fell apart on documentation, and she had no intention of building something on a weak foundation. At 4 o'clock, Daniel texted photo enhancement complete. Can you come to the Bay Street office? She went. The enhanced photograph was printed large and mounted on the conference room wall. The perspective was from below the water surface looking up the hull of the Ridge Runner, above the afternoon light filtering down through the Georgia coastal water, greenish and layered. At the stern, visible through the surface, a figure leaning over the transom looking down. The enhancement had resolved the face enough to be identifiable. It was a woman mid-40s with the close-cropped silver hair of someone who had stopped caring about that particular presentation, and the lean build of someone who spent significant time in physical work. She was wearing dark clothing and looking directly down into the water with an expression that was not casual. Who is she? Margaret said. Daniel pointed to a document on the table beside the photograph. Renata Alves, 46 years old. She runs a maritime salvage consulting operation based out of St. Simon's Island. She has legitimate credentials, licensed salvage master, former commercial diver, 15 years of documented work in southeastern coastal waters. He paused. She's also been a contractor for 2 of the previous structures that Carter Aldous built and dismantled. Her name appears in the periphery of both prior investigations. It was never enough to charge her. She's the dive operation, Margaret said. She was coordinating the extraction. She was in the water or supervising from the Ridge Runner, probably both at different stages. He looked at the photograph. Vernon's last underwater image has her on that boat. That puts her at the site during the active extraction phase. Is she named in the warrant applications? She was added this morning based on the photographs. He looked at the printout. 3 arrest targets, Hewitt, Aldous, Alves. Margaret looked at the woman's face in the photograph, the intentional quality of her looking down at the water, someone who understood what was underneath, and had decided that what was underneath was a resource and not a story. The particular blindness that produced the ability to look directly at the evidence of people's lives and see only something extractable. There are buyers, she said. Items from that hold have been sold. Provenance documents created. The forensic accountants are working backward through Tidewater's financial structure. The distribution network will be identified in that process. Daniel paused. It's going to take time. The arrests are the beginning of that, not the end. And the wreck site. The formal protection designation from Georgia DNR is being expedited. We've been in contact with the state office this afternoon. The designation should come through within 72 hours of the warrants, which will trigger the full federal archaeological survey. Margaret thought about 65 feet of water over a wreck from 1857 and what was in it and what had been taken from it and what that meant to the people who were alive today, who understood that what was down there was not an artifact collection, but a connection. She thought about 3 years of advocacy by descendant communities trying to get the site protected, and the 18-month delay while the DNR process ran its course, and Carter Aldous using that window with the calculation of someone who had run this calculation before. She thought about Vernon Sills free diving to 20 feet with a phone in a waterproof case, taking 34 photographs of what was happening and surfacing, and going home and calling his daughter, and making a plan for what to do if the plan didn't work. It had worked. He hadn't been here to see it work, but it had. The warrants, she said. Timeline. Judge Holloway has reviewed the applications. Her clerk indicated we should expect the signed warrants by tomorrow morning. He looked at the photograph one more time. When the arrests execute the people we're moving on, we'll have legal counsel within the hour. The investigation becomes visible at that point. Everything that was quiet becomes public. He looked at her. Your role becomes public. Your name will appear in the documentation that goes to defense counsel in discovery. I know. Your professional relationship with Coastal Meridian Marine Holdings insurer, the engagement that brought you to the Leonora Blue technically becomes a conflict of interest at that point. It became a conflict of interest the moment I found what I found, she said. I stopped being their appraiser at the engine room of that boat. I'm a material witness now and have been since yesterday. She met his eyes. That's the distinction. He held her gaze for a moment. There was something in his face, not surprise, more like the specific recognition of someone who has been watching how another person handles a difficult thing and has drawn a conclusion from it. Yes, he said, that's the distinction exactly. Yam. She drove to Whitmarsh Island that evening to tell Adele. Adele was in the kitchen when she arrived making dinner. She had apparently not been tasting the distracted quality of someone who had been managing the days through sheer forward motion. She looked up when Margaret came in and read something in her face. Tell me, she said. Margaret sat at the kitchen table and told her everything that she was able to tell the photographs, the wreck site, the warrants, the 3 arrest targets. She told her what her father had seen in that wreck and what it meant that he had documented it. She told her that his photographs were going to be central to the federal case and that his binder was already in federal evidence and that the account he had kept of everything he had witnessed was the clearest record that existed of what Tidewater Guarantee Group had been doing. Adele listened to all of it with her hands flat on the table and did not move until Margaret had finished. Then she said, he knew what was in that wreck. He understood what they were stealing. Yes, the description in his binder, he called them people's things. He wrote that twice on 2 separate days. Margaret looked at her. He knew what it meant, and he went back anyway. He documented it knowing they might have seen him. Adele was quiet for a long moment. He used to say that some things you couldn't walk away from once you knew about them. He said that was the test of who you were, what you couldn't walk away from. She looked at her hands. I always thought that was just something Father said. It's what he was, Margaret said. Yes, she was quiet again. He would have wanted the people who those things belonged to know that someone tried to stop it. I know. Margaret paused. There are community representatives who've been advocating for that site for 3 years. The federal case is going to require their involvement, the documentation of what was taken, the identification of the items, the process of recovery and return where it's possible. The case will bring them to the center of it, where they should have been from the beginning. Yes. Adele looked at the window over the sink, the marsh view that was the particular view of Whitmarsh Island grass and water and the long flat light of the Georgia coastal evening. He would have wanted to see that, she said. He would have wanted to sit in that room when the case was made. Margaret said nothing. There was nothing to say to that was not too small for what it contained. After a moment, Adele said, Who do I call if something feels wrong while this is happening? Me, Margaret said immediately. And Daniel Frey, I'll give you both numbers. She paused. Your father was careful about who he trusted with the evidence. I want you to be careful too in the next few weeks. Not frightened careful. The difference is about what you do with the awareness. Adele looked at her. What's the difference in practice? You tell people you trust where you're going before you go. You don't take calls from numbers you don't recognize without letting them go to voicemail first. You call me if anything at all seems out of place. She met Adele's eyes. The people being arrested tomorrow are calculated people who have done this before. That doesn't mean you're in danger. It means you're a witness in a significant federal case, and it's appropriate to behave accordingly. My father behaved accordingly, Adele said. He planned for it. He did. Margaret paused. He got every part of it right. The documentation, the binder, the call to you. He made the plan work even past the point where he couldn't. She looked at Adele steadily. You've done the same. You watched the driveway. You called me. You held the binder. She paused. Your father trusted you with the most important part of it, and you carried it correctly. Adele looked at the table. He said you'd know what to do with it, she said quietly. I didn't know what he meant. He must have meant someone like you. Margaret drove home across the marshes in the last light of the April evening. The Whitmarsh Island Causeway, and then the highway, and then Jones Street, and she sat on her porch in the dark for a while and thought about what Vernon Sills had planned for and what it cost to be the person who went out anyway. Some things you couldn't walk away from once you knew about them. She had known that for 11 years. It was the reason she was still doing this work. Come. The warrants executed at 6 a.m. on a Thursday. Daniel called at 6:48. Hewitt in custody. Alves in custody. Aldous. A brief pause. Aldous was not at his registered address. He's in the wind. Margaret sat up. We have surveillance on his vehicles and his financial accounts. He can't move money without triggering an alert, and he can't use his registered vehicle without us knowing. He said it with the steadiness of someone who had contingency plan for this. He's not gone, he's somewhere in the southeastern corridor, and we'll have him. But he's aware the warrant's executed. How long? Hours, a day at most. His attorney made contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office at 7 a.m., which means Aldous is in communication with his legal team, and they're negotiating his surrender. He paused. The attorney's move suggests Aldous is not planning to flee permanently, he's calculating his position. He thinks he can manage this. He's managed it twice before. His voice was even. This time the evidence is different. He hasn't had a Vernon Sills before. She looked at the morning through her bent glass window. The river was doing its morning thing, wide and particular, catching the early light. The wreck site, she said. DNR designation came through at 7:15. Federal protective status effective immediately. The Coast Guard has a vessel on site now. He paused. No one is going into that wreck except the authorized archaeological survey team. She felt something release slightly in her chest. The descendant communities, she said. I called the community liaison director at 5 a.m. She knew within minutes of the warrants. He said it with the quiet of someone for whom that call had been the important one. She's been waiting for 3 years. She said, he stopped. She said, thank you for calling before it was on the news. Margaret looked at the river. That was the right call to make first, she said. Yes. He was quiet. I'll be in Savannah by mid-morning. There's a press conference at 11. The U.S. Attorney's Office is handling it, not me. After that, I'll have time to debrief properly. He paused. Can we meet at your office after the press conference? There are next steps for your formal role as a witness. My office, 1 o'clock. She spent the morning at her desk and worked and thought and watched the river, which never changed its essential character, regardless of what was happening on its banks. She thought about Carter Aldous, calculating his position somewhere in the southeastern corridor, his attorney on the phone with the U.S. Attorney's Office, the specific quality of a person who had built and dismantled 2 prior operations and believed he could navigate this one. She thought about what made this one different. 34 photographs, a 3-ring binder in a daughter's careful hands, a pump housing with clean thread on the bolt holes. Vernon Sills had built the difference. He had built it over 3 months of careful documentation with a waterproof phone case and a handwriting that matched his maintenance logs. Aldous surrendered at 11:53. His attorney released a statement calling the charges unfounded. The U.S. Attorney's press conference noted the charges and referred all questions about the evidence to the court process. Margaret read both statements on her phone and put the phone face down on the desk and went back to work. Daniel arrived at her Factors Walk office at 1:15, which meant the press conference had run long. He sat in one of the good chairs and looked like a person who had been awake since 4 a.m. and was running on the specific fuel of a thing arriving at the right result. She put coffee in front of him. He took it without comment. Aldous is in custody, he said. His attorney is processing the surrender conditions now. There will be a bail hearing by end of week. He paused. The bail application will be opposed by the U.S. Attorney's Office. Aldous has resources, and the prior pattern of dismantling investigations suggests flight risk. What's the likelihood he's held? Good. The judge assigned to the case has a history with economic crime defendants and understands the nature of the risk. He looked at the folder he'd brought. Next steps for you, Petra will schedule your full formal witness preparation session within the next 2 weeks. Your testimony will be in the insurance fraud component of the trial, the policy structure, the Tidewater reinsurance mechanism, the 3 vessels, and what the pattern indicates. When is the trial estimated? 8 to 10 months. Trial preparation in federal complex cases takes time, particularly when 3 defendants have separate counsel and the evidentiary record is as extensive as this one. He looked at her. You should plan for that period to involve periodic travel to Brunswick. That's where the trial will be held, and potential witness preparation sessions here in Savannah. I can plan for that. Good. He set down the coffee cup. There's something else. The community liaison director, her name is Josephine Baxter, has asked if there's someone she can speak with about the process, the formal archaeology and the evidence of what was taken. She's not asking for case information. She's asking about the physical condition of the site and what the survey process looks like and what timelines she should communicate to the families who are connected to this. You're asking if I'd talk to her. You're not a federal agent, and you're not bound by the same confidentiality constraints. You've seen the photographs and you've read the binder. You understand what was there and what it means. He looked at her steadily. She's been waiting 3 years. The communities have been waiting longer. I thought there might be someone who could have an honest conversation with her that isn't filtered through the requirements of the prosecution. Margaret thought about what she had looked at in Vernon Sills' binder, the descriptions of what he'd seen in that hold, the way he'd written people's things in his careful handwriting twice because he had understood exactly what he was looking at, and it had mattered to him that the record reflected that. I'll call her, she said. I'll send you her contact information tonight. He paused. Margaret. She looked at him. He had a quality that she'd been noting across the past 2 days, not in the way she usually noted things about people in a professional context, which was functional and filing system, but in a different register. The quality of someone who arrived already organized, who said difficult things precisely because imprecision would be a form of disrespect, who had called the community liaison director at 5 in the morning because that was the right call to make first. The quality of someone for whom doing the right thing was not an achievement, but simply the operating standard. She had not been thinking about that quality specifically. She was thinking about it now. I want to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. The Della blew Della Price's boat out of Brunswick. Her claim is in dispute and no one has physically examined the hull. He paused. If she agrees to an independent examination, would you be willing to do it? As part of the federal case, not as an insurer's contractor, the examination would be a federal evidence item. Yes, Margaret said. Of course. He nodded. Good. He stood. I'm driving back to Brunswick this evening. I'll be back in Savannah by Monday. There are follow-up interviews, and the formal evidence catalog from the Aldous surrender is going to need review. He paused. I'll call over the weekend with any updates. Call whenever there is something that matters, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Everything about this case matters. I know, she said, but some things matter more urgently than others. Use your judgment. He looked at her with the assessment qualities she was recognizing now as his register for things he was taking seriously. All right, he said. He left. She stayed at the desk and looked at the river and thought about the specific shape of the past 48 hours, the speed of it, the density, the way each piece of evidence had led to the next, with the logic of a case that had been waiting to be found and was releasing itself once someone started looking. Vernon Sills had started the looking. She had continued it. Daniel had built it into something that would hold. That was how it worked, when all the right people found each other at the right time. She called Adele at 5 o'clock. They have them, Margaret said. Adele was quiet for a long moment. All of them. All 3. They'll be in court for bail hearings by end of week. Another pause. The site, Adele said. The wreck. Is it protected now? It's protected now. The Coast Guard has a vessel on it and the formal federal designation came through this morning. No one goes in that water without authorization. Good. She said it with the control of someone who had been waiting for good news to feel like good news and was being careful about letting it. My father would have wanted that, more than any of the rest of it, that the site was protected. The people in that wreck. She paused. He understood what they were toward the end, what it meant that their things were still down there. He documented it like it mattered, Margaret said, because it did. Yes, a long pause. Thank you, Margaret. Your father did the work, she said. I just followed it. She walked home through the Savannah evening. The squares were doing their April thing, the fountains and the live oaks and the azaleas fully committed. Now the city at its most purely itself, the particular quality that it had in spring, when everything that had been there for 300 years was briefly, insistently alive again. She walked through Chippewa Square and Lafayette Square and came out on Jones Street and went up to her porch and sat in the dark with the garden below her and the city around her and thought about what she had found in the engine room of the Leonora Blue 48 hours ago and where that finding had led. Sometimes the evidence led exactly where it needed to go. When it did, you followed it all the way. The formal witness preparation sessions began 2 weeks after the arrests in a conference room at the Brunswick Federal Courthouse that Petra Haas had arranged on a Tuesday in May. Margaret drove down from Savannah on Monday evening and stayed at a downtown Brunswick hotel that had the quality of places that served working purposes rather than tourist ones, functional, clean, without the decorative ambitions of a coastal resort, and therefore entirely appropriate to what she was doing there. Petra ran the sessions with the thorough economy of a junior attorney who understood that her job was to make the case hold, which meant making the witnesses hold, which meant covering every possible angle of cross-examination until the answers were precise without being rehearsed. She ran Margaret through her professional background, her methodology, her findings on the Leonora Blue pump, and the tidewater pattern analysis in that order, slowly the way you built a foundation before putting weight on it. On the second afternoon, Petra ran mock cross-examination. The defense attorneys, Aldis had a prominent Atlanta firm, Alves had a Brunswick specialist, Hewitt was working with a court-appointed attorney who was better than most at that work, were each going to have their own approach to Margaret. Petra modeled 3 versions. The first approach was technical challenge. Was Margaret qualified to distinguish between a deliberate disconnection and a vibration failure? At the coupling, Margaret answered that clearly. Her 11 years of hull examination included 17 cases involving bilge system failures of various modes, and the thread condition on the bolt holes was not consistent with any of them. It was consistent with deliberate disassembly. The second approach was conflict of interest. Wasn't it true that Margaret's professional relationship with the insurer that retained her had been terminated because of this case, giving her a financial motive to build the case against the insurer's affiliate? Margaret answered that too. The financial reality was the opposite. Testifying against a major insurer reduced her likelihood of future engagements from similar companies, not increased it. She had chosen to follow the evidence because that was the job. The job did not offer financial bonuses for finding fraud. The third approach, the one she hadn't fully anticipated, was her relationship with the investigating attorney. Wasn't it true that she had worked in close professional proximity to Daniel Frey throughout the investigation, and that this proximity might have shaped her interpretation of the evidence? She felt briefly wrong-footed, then she found it. I found the pump disconnection before I called anyone, she said. I called Daniel Frey because what I found required the right response. The evidence came first. The relationship to the investigating authority came second. She paused. The thread condition on the coupling is in the photographs I took independently before any federal contact. The photographs have a timestamp. The timeline is in the record. Good, Petra said. Say exactly that. She added, and the professional proximity you're describing amounted to 2 days of coordinated investigation. The evidence doesn't improve because 2 people examined it together. It improves because both examined it rigorously. Petra made a note. Even better, keep both. That evening, walking the Brunswick waterfront after the session, Margaret thought about the third challenge and what had produced her brief moment of wrong-footedness. It was not the question itself. She had known from the beginning of the investigation that her working proximity to Daniel would be the kind of thing a defense attorney would try to use. It was the word the mock cross-examination had used, relationship, which was at this point in the arc of things not an entirely inaccurate word. Not in the way the cross-examination implied their professional behavior had been entirely clean, but relationship in the broader sense, the mutual recognition of 2 people who operated by the same standard and had arrived at that understanding through the specific pressure of difficult shared work. She had been noting the constituent parts of that recognition for 2 weeks. The way he arrived organized and stayed organized under pressure. The 5 a.m. call to Josephine Baxter. The manner in which he handled Adele Sills at the kitchen table, not managing her grief but being honest with her about her father in a way that respected both the grief and the man. The way he asked rather than instructed, including asking her to stay involved in ways that were not within his authority to require. She had been noting these things in the specific filing system of her attention, and the file was getting substantial. She walked back to the hotel and called Adele as she did every few days, and they talked about the preparations in the upcoming bail hearing and the timeline of the trial. Adele was doing what Adele did, managing teaching, showing up to the routines that held the days together. She had been to see the Leonora Blue at the Marine Yard in Garden City twice since the arrests. "She looks like she's waiting," Adele said. "Does that make sense? She's just sitting there on the blocks and she looks like she's waiting for something." "What do you want to happen to her?" Margaret asked. Adele was quiet for a moment. "I want her somewhere my father's colleagues can see her. He didn't have a big life. He had the water and the boat and his 3 daughters and his community. I want her somewhere people who understood that life can go and see her and know what she was part of." "We'll make that happen," Margaret said. "How?" "The Thunderbolt Marina has a heritage pier. They berth historical vessels there for the community to see. Oscar Belk mentioned it when I spoke with him." She paused. "After the trial, when the evidence hold on the boat is lifted, I'll work with Oscar to arrange it." Adele was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. And then after a pause, "My father would have found it embarrassing. He never liked being made much of." "Then the boat can carry the story," Margaret said. "He doesn't have to." The bail hearings happened over 2 days at the end of May. Aldous was denied bail. The judge accepted the flight risk argument and the prior pattern argument and the financial sophistication argument. Alves was held on a bond that required GPS monitoring and surrender of her dive certifications. Hewitt was released on a bond with standard conditions. His cooperation agreement, which his attorney had negotiated in the first week, had produced a different legal posture than the other defendants. Hewitt's cooperation was generating information about the distribution network that the forensic accountants had been working on. Through Hewitt, the investigation had identified 7 private collectors in the southeastern United States who had purchased items from the Leonora Blue wreck extraction operation. Subpoenas had been issued. 3 of the 7 had immediately contacted attorneys of their own. The items, when they were described in the subpoena documentation, were specific an intact set of combs and hairpin silver with particular engraving that matched an inventory description from 1857. A leather-bound journal with a handwritten inscription in the front cover. 2 pairs of shoes, children's sizes. A ceramic vessel with a maker's mark consistent with Low Country Gullah craftsmanship of the mid-19th century. There were others. 14 items in total that had been documented sufficiently to be traced. Josephine Baxter. When Margaret called her on a Tuesday in late May, already knew about the items. She had been in contact with the federal case team about the subpoenas and had been preparing the community for what the information might mean, both the pain of it and the possibility. "The journal," Josephine said. "If the inscription in the journal identifies a person, the forensic team is working on it," Margaret said. "The journal was in private hands for 2 years, and its condition has been affected. But the inscription is partially legible." She paused. "I'm told that the community genealogy group has documents that may help identify the person. The federal team is going to facilitate that connection." "Daniel Frey told me," Josephine said. "He called me before the subpoena list went to the collectors. He said he wanted me to know what was on the list before the defense attorney's filings made it public." A pause. "You learn a lot about what kind of person someone is by whether they think to make that call." "Yes," Margaret said, "you do." She met Daniel on a Wednesday evening in early June in Savannah at a restaurant on the waterfront that was his suggestion. Not a tourist place, not a federal building adjacent place. A working waterfront restaurant on the east side of the river where the light came in from the water in the late afternoon, and the menu was the local fish menu of a place that had been doing this since before Savannah decided it was charming. They had been meeting at his request, or her request, approximately once a week since the arrests, partly for case updates and partly for the kind of conversation that was not specifically about the case but was adjacent to it. The questions that the case raised about evidence and accountability, and what the law could do and what it could not do, and where the gap between those two things left the people who were most affected by the outcome. Daniel was good at that conversation. He had the qualities she had noted in the first 48 hours, the willingness to be fully present in a difficult discussion without managing it toward a comfortable conclusion. He could say, "I don't know," and have it mean something other than evasion. On the Wednesday evening in June, they ate dinner and talked about the journal and what the genealogy group had determined from the partial inscription. They talked about the subpoenas and the collection network. They talked about Della Price in her examination, which Margaret had completed the previous week. The Della Blue's bilge pump showed the same deliberate disconnection pattern as the Leonora Blue. Different pump, different vessel, same hand. Alves, Daniel said. The thread pattern on the bolt holes has the same removal signature, Margaret said. I've documented it comparatively. She paused. Della Price is lucky to be alive. If she hadn't been close enough to shore to get a life ring from a passing recreational boater, I know. He said it with the compression of someone who had already looked at that particular calculation and was not comfortable with how close it had run. Della's testimony is going to be important. She didn't document anything the way Vernon did. She didn't know what to document, but she's a credible witness to the sinking conditions, and her account of the boat's condition before that night contradicts the maintenance failure narrative. She's been on the water since she was 17, Margaret said. She is not going to be successfully cross-examined on whether she knew her bilge pump. No, the slight quality that was his version of rye. She is not. They ate in companionable silence for a stretch, the restaurant doing its early evening thing around them. The Savannah waterfront visible through the windows, the river moving. She had been in enough working dinners across 11 years to know the difference between a dinner that was about the work and a dinner that was about the people at the table using the work as the occasion. This had become the latter without either of them announcing it, which was the way those things went when they went correctly. The trial is 8 months out, he said. Probably. Your testimony is expected in the 3rd week of trial. I know. In the interim, he paused. He set down his fork. He was doing the organizing before speaking thing that she had cataloged as characteristic. In the interim, I'm going to be in Savannah at least twice a month through the fall. The case file requires it, and I have a preference for working close to the evidence. She looked at him. He met her eyes. I'm telling you my schedule, he said, because I'd like to have dinner when I'm in town. Not for case purposes. I'd like to be clear about the distinction. She thought about the mock cross-examination and the word relationship, and the fact that she had not found the question entirely off base, only the implication. She thought about the file she had been building in her attention for 6 weeks, the constituent parts of it, and what the accumulation meant. I know the distinction, she said. Good. He picked up his fork again. Then we understand each other. We understand each other, she said. They finished dinner and walked out to the waterfront afterward. The June evening doing what Savannah June evenings did, the specific, warm, humid quality of a coastal southern city in summer, the live oaks overhead, the river wide and dark and moving. They walked east along the riverfront for a while without particular destination and talked about things that were not the case. His years at sea before law school, the particular calculus of deciding to become an attorney rather than staying in maritime operations. Her time in Atlanta before Savannah, the specific education of learning to read hull damage in the first years of the work, the cases that had made her competent and the cases that had tested whether she would stay that way. She noted, telling him things about herself that she did not generally volunteer in professional contexts. He was listening in the way that she had come to recognize as characteristic fully, with the organized attention of someone who was actually interested, not performing interest as a social courtesy. You stayed in Savannah, he said, after the 2-year contract. The city kept me. She looked at the river. And the caseload here has a quality I haven't found anywhere else. The maritime work in this corridor is complicated in specific ways. The history is in the water. The history is very much in the water, he said. She looked at him. How long have you been in the Brunswick sector? 4 years. Before that, the Gulf Coast. Before that, overseas maritime postings. He paused. I've been doing federal maritime law enforcement long enough to know that the southeastern corridor is where most of the genuinely difficult cases are. The intersection of environmental law and cultural property law and maritime law and insurance fraud, it doesn't happen that densely anywhere else. So you chose it. I chose to stay when I could have transferred. He looked at the river. I had reasons. She heard the slight weight in that, not a confession, not a door flung open, but a door she could note and remember. She noted it. They walked back to the parking area and said goodnight with the particular restraint of 2 people who had agreed on something by implication and did not need to announce it. She drove home to Jones Street and sat on her porch and thought about the evening, which had been what it was, and about what the next 8 months would look like, and about the specific quality of patience that was not waiting, but working, building towards something while doing the necessary thing in front of you. Vernon Sills had that quality. He had built for 3 months while doing his necessary work and had trusted what he built to outlast him. She would work the case. The case would take the time it took. What came after would come when it came. She went inside and slept well, which the Jones Street porch and the particular quality of the Savannah night seemed collectively to produce. The summer was the specific texture of a federal case in its pretrial phase. Dense document intensive, the accumulation of every piece of evidence into the record that would hold the prosecution in the courtroom. Margaret worked her other cases and drove to Brunswick for witness preparation sessions and called Adele every week and had dinner with Daniel when he was in Savannah, which was twice a month, and then 3 times in July, and then twice again in August, the rhythm varying according to the caseload, but maintaining the regularity of something that had become expected by both parties. She met Josephine Baxter in person in July at a community center in Darien that served the descendant communities of the coastal Georgia islands. Josephine was 62 and had been doing genealogical and historical advocacy work for over 20 years, with the particular combination of precision and patience of someone who had spent decades working with incomplete records toward incomplete but important results. They sat at a long table in the community center with the research files that Josephine and her organization had assembled on the 1857 vessel, and Margaret looked at what 3 years of advocacy work looked like from the inside. It looked like meticulous. It looked like the same discipline Margaret brought to hull examination, the careful building from what was certain toward what could be established, the notes that marked what was known and what was probable and what remained unknown. The documents were different. The methodology was familiar. The journal inscription, after 2 months of archival work combining the forensic team's enhanced imaging with the community group's records, had been partially identified. The inscription was a name, a place, and a year, Sable Port Royal, 1857. The community genealogy records contained 3 women named Sable in their documentation of the Port Royal area in the mid-19th century, one of whom had a direct line of descent that Josephine's team had been building for 11 years. "We don't know it's her," Josephine said carefully. "We know it could be her. The forensic team says the journal paper and ink composition are consistent with the period. The name is not common enough to be coincidental." She paused. "We're treating it with care. We don't make claims we can't support." "That's the right approach," Margaret said. "It's the only approach that's honest." Josephine looked at the documents. "When the trial is over and the items are returned to us, the ones that can be recovered, we're going to have to decide what to do with them, how to hold them, how to make them part of the record in a way that is honest about their history rather than sanitizing it." She looked at Margaret. "The journal especially. If it belonged to someone specific, that changes what it means to hold it." "It changes what it means to have had it taken," Margaret said. "Yes." She was quiet. What Tidewater Guarantee Group did was not unusual in kind. People have been taking things from places they had no right to take them from for a very long time. What's unusual is that this time there's a federal prosecution. She paused. "That's because of you and Daniel Frey and Vernon Sills." "Primarily because of Vernon Sills," Margaret said. "Yes." Josephine looked at her. "He was a working man who understood what he was looking at. Not everyone would have." "No." He went back to document it. She said it with the weight of someone for whom going back, returning to a site, to a history, to a claim that was incomplete, was not abstract. He went back even after he'd gotten out, after he thought he was clear. She paused. He knew what it meant when he saw it. That kind of knowing is its own thing. Margaret thought about Vernon's binder entry, People's Things. Twice in the same careful handwriting that recorded the pump inspections and the route changes. He knew, she said. He absolutely knew. She drove back to Savannah that afternoon through the coastal Georgia landscape, the salt marshes and the tidal rivers and the long, flat light of the summer low country, the particular green of the marsh grass in July, when the heat was at its fullest and the coast was most fully itself. She had driven this stretch of road enough times in the months since April to know it, with the accumulated knowledge of familiar roads, the way the light changed over the marsh at different times of day, the particular way the Ogeechee River looked from the highway bridge. She thought about what Josephine had said, this time there's a federal prosecution. The implication of this time, that most of the time there wasn't that. Most of the time people took what they took and cleaned the provenance, and the items disappeared into collections with fabricated documentation, and no one built the chain that made the next thing possible. Vernon Sills had built the chain. He had built it carefully and precisely, and in the full knowledge that it might cost him everything, and it had, in the chain held. She was going to make sure the chain held all the way to the verdict. In August, Tommy Cress came forward. He was 58, the crab boat owner from Darien, and he had heard about the federal case through the Coastal Maritime Community Network. The Low Country was a small enough world that major federal maritime prosecutions traveled fast, and he had called Daniel Frey's office number on a Tuesday morning and said that he thought he needed to talk to someone. Margaret sat in on the interview at the Brunswick field office, which Daniel had arranged because her pattern analysis of the three vessels had been what put the question of the other boats on the table. Tommy Cress was compact and weathered and had the look of someone who had decided in the past week to say a thing he had been not saying for 4 months. He sat at the conference room table and looked at his hands and described in the flat, practical manner of a man who worked with facts rather than interpretations what had happened to the Amber Sound. He had been hired by Gerald Hewitt 3 months before his boat sank. Different framing. Tommy had been told it was deep-water oceanographic research sample collection from the seafloor. He had transported canisters different from the ones Vernon had described, but the same general size to coordinates he was given. He had delivered them and returned. He had been paid and had asked no questions. His boat had sunk on the calm night with what was characterized as a bilge failure. He had been close enough to the Darien docks to swim to safety. He had never believed the failure explanation he knew as bilge system, but the claim had been paid and he had been alone in his doubt, and he had decided at 58 that being alone in your doubt about a federal-level operation was not a position he had the resources to sustain. The photographs in the news, he said. He meant the crime scene photographs that had been in the local maritime news coverage of the arrests. The canisters in those photographs, they matched what I transported. Different color, different branding, but the same configuration. He looked at Daniel. I should have called you sooner. You called now, Daniel said. That's what matters. After walking to the parking lot, Margaret said, the same hand disconnected his pump. Almost certainly, Daniel said. Alves, we'll need a physical examination of the Amber Sound. Do you know if it's been salvaged? The insurer paid this claim without inspection. The wreck hasn't been raised. It's probably in the Marsh Creek where it went down. She paused. I know the DNR survey coordinator in that area. She can likely identify the exact location from the Coast Guard incident record. Get me the location and we'll schedule a dive survey. He looked at her. You're good at this. At what specifically? At knowing where the next piece is before it's visible. He said it with the directness that she had stopped being surprised by and had simply come to expect. Not guessing following the logic of what you know toward the next thing that should be there. It's the methodology, she said. It's also how you think, he said. The methodology is what you use. The thinking is what makes the methodology produce anything. She looked at him. The August morning light over the Brunswick waterfront was doing its particular low-country August thing, heavy and saturated the humidity visible in the quality of the light, the bay behind them flat and silver. When this case is resolved, she said, I want to take you somewhere that isn't a conference room or a waterfront restaurant within a reasonable driving distance of a federal building. He looked at her. In 11 years, she had not been the one to say the thing first, and she was saying it, and it was correct. Where did you have in mind, he said. There's a barrier island south of Savannah that takes 40 minutes by boat, the kind of place where there's nothing to do except pay attention to what's there. She paused. You'd appreciate that kind of place. How do you know? Because you called Josephine Baxter at 5 in the morning, she said. Because the way you pay attention to things is the way that kind of place rewards. He was quiet for a moment. I'd like to see that island, he said. The case first, she said. The case first, he agreed. He looked at the bay. But I'm noting that you've made the offer, so that it's in the record. It's in the record, she said. She drove back to Savannah and worked the afternoon and felt the particular quality of having said the right thing in the right way at the right time, which was its own kind of clarity. She had been building the file in her attention for 4 months. The file was complete enough now to know what it contained. The case would take the time it took. The island would be there when the case was done. She went back to work. -E. The Amber Sound was located in September. The DNR survey coordinator, a woman named Bianca Terrell, who had the practical energy of someone who spent most of her professional life either in the water or navigating the bureaucracy that governed the water, located the wreck within 2 days of Margaret's call using the Coast Guard incident coordinates and a side-scan sonar survey of the Darien Marsh Creek system. She sent Margaret the GPS fix on a Thursday morning, and by Friday afternoon, a Coast Guard dive team was in the water. Margaret was not on the dive boat. Her involvement at that stage was as a coordinating witness, not an active investigator, but Daniel called her from the water at 3 in the afternoon with the dive team's preliminary findings. Same pattern, he said. Through-hull coupling starboard aft. Same removal signature as the Leonora Blue and Della Blue. The forensic diver described it in the same language you use: clean thread, no stress fracture, no corrosion, no mechanical failure. Removed. He paused. 3 boats. 3 deliberate disconnections. Alves ran the dive operation on the wreck site. The inference that she also ran the pump disconnections on the 3 vessels is now very well supported. Have her attorneys said anything? She's still not cooperating. Her legal position is to fight the connection to the wreck site on the physical evidence alone. They're preparing to challenge the forensic provenance of Vernon's photographs. The pump pattern eliminates the isolation of her connection to any one event. It's a pattern of conduct. He paused. The 3 vessels are the connective tissue. The forensic evidence on all 3 needs to be in a single comparative report, Margaret said. The thread removal signature, the pump configuration, the timing relative to the wreck site extraction phases. That's what I need you to write, he said. Can you have a draft to Petra by end of next week? Yes. She spent the following week writing the comparative technical analysis. The 3 vessels, the 3 pump failures, the physical documentation of each, the statistical and forensic argument for a common hand in the 3 removals. It was the most technically dense thing she had written in 11 years of appraisal work, and she wrote it with the care that the moment deserved, marking every inference clearly distinguishing established evidence from professional opinion, building it the way you built a hull from the keel. Up no weak points in the load-bearing structure. Petra reviewed it in a 2-hour session and said, "This is the clearest forensic document we have in the case. Don't change anything." Not changing anything was not quite true. Petra flagged 3 formulations that needed technical clarification and 2 that needed supporting citation, but the substance held. The report went into the federal evidence package on a Monday in late September, and Daniel sent her a 1-sentence text when it did. The 3 vessels are the case. She sat with that for a moment, then she went back to work. The fall was the specific quality of the Savannah low country in autumn, the heat softening by degrees, the Spanish moss doing its light change thing as the angle of the sun moved the river at a different color in October than it was in July. More amber and less silver. The marsh grass going from green to gold in the tidal drainage patterns that gave the landscape its particular texture. Margaret worked her 3 active cases and drove to Brunswick and sat in the conference room with Petra and worked through the testimony preparation in the sections that were available before the trial proper. She called Adele every week. She met Josephine for coffee in Savannah once, and in Darien once, talking about the forensic progress on the journal inscription and the community's preparation for the trial, and what recovery might look like for the items that were traced through the collector network. 12 of the 14 subpoenaed items had been identified in private collections. 9 of the 12 collectors had returned the items voluntarily under the subpoena after consultation with their attorneys once the actual historical context was explained in the federal filings. 3 were contesting the subpoenas. 3, Josephine said on the Savannah Coffee. Of 12, those 3 people looked at the documentation of where those items came from and decided that their legal argument was the priority. Their attorneys decided, Margaret said. That's the distinction. It's a distinction that doesn't comfort anyone who knows what's in those collections, Josephine said. But I take the point. She looked at her coffee. The 9 who returned them, voluntarily 2 of them called me directly. Not through attorneys. Called my office to say they were returning the items and that they wanted me to know they were sorry for having had them. She paused. I don't know what to do with that exactly. They didn't know what they were acquiring. Tidewater's provenance documentation was convincing, but they knew enough to feel the weight of it when the truth was visible. That's something, Margaret said. It's something, Josephine agreed. I'm not sure yet what to call it. She paused. One of them, a collector in Charleston, said she wanted to participate in whatever process we set up for the items after the trial. She's a historian. She said the items deserve to be in the right hands with the full historical context, and that meant our hands, and she wanted to help facilitate that rather than just return the items and step away. What did you tell her? I said I'd think about it. Josephine looked at her coffee. I've been thinking about it. I think there's a version of that conversation that's useful. I think there's also a version where it's an absolution transaction. She participates in the process and gets to feel like she did the right thing, rather than having to sit with the fact that she made an error. Those two versions look similar from the outside. She paused. I'm trying to figure out which one she's actually offering. Margaret thought about that for a while after the conversation. The difficulty of distinguishing genuine accountability from the social performance of accountability, and how you made that assessment when the person was trying to do something you couldn't dismiss. She did not have a clean answer. She thought it might be the kind of question that Josephine was better positioned than she was to navigate, which was an appropriate recognition of the limits of her role in this. Her role was to make the evidence hold. The communities would decide what to do with the outcome. Daniel called on a Thursday in October to say that the trial date had been set the second Monday in February, 8 months from the arrests. The trial preparation was complete. The evidence was in. The three defendants, she said. Cooperation status. Hewitt is cooperating, full agreement in place. His testimony covers the operational details of the hiring scheme, the logistics of the pump operations, and his conversations with Aldous about the decision to handle Vernon Sills as a threat. He paused. He didn't know Vernon Sills by name. He referred to him in his operational records as the Thunderbolt contractor. He's been told that's the man who died. How did he take that? He's a complicated person in a bad situation, Daniel said. His attorney has done a competent job structuring his cooperation. The personal reckoning, whether he's done it or whether he'll do it, is not my job to assess. He paused. Alves remains in a fighting posture. Her attorneys have filed 11 pretrial motions. We've addressed 10 of them. The 11th is a challenge to the admissibility of Vernon's underwater photographs on chain of custody grounds. The chain of custody from the waterproof case to the forensic imaging unit, Margaret said. There's a gap in the documentation between the Coast Guard evidence inventory and the handoff to the forensic unit, 3 hours of clerical error in the timestamp documentation. He paused. We've addressed it through supplementary declaration from the evidence technician. I believe the judge will find it sufficient, but it's a real challenge, which is why they filed it. If the photographs are excluded, the case doesn't collapse. The dive team's documentation and Tommy Kress's testimony and Hewitt's cooperation fill a great deal of the evidentiary picture. But Vernon's photographs are the clearest link between the wreck site activity and the Ridge Runner and Alves's direct involvement. He said it with the steadiness of someone who had been looking at this contingency for weeks and had made his peace with the uncertainty. We'll know before trial whether the judge rules them admissible. And if they're not, then we build the case with what we have and we make it hold without them. He paused. Margaret, the judge is going to find them admissible. The supplementary declaration is solid, and the chain of custody challenge is a procedural argument without substantive merit. I'm confident about this. I know you are, she said. Tell me anyway if the ruling comes in when it comes. You'll know before anyone outside the case team, he said. She filed that promise and went back to work. The ruling came in on a Monday in November. She was at the Garden City Marine Yard doing an examination on an unrelated claim when her phone rang. Daniel's voice, even and precise as always, with the thing underneath it that she had learned to hear admissible, all 34 photographs. The judge found the supplementary declaration sufficient and characterized the chain of custody challenge as without substantive merit. He paused. In those exact words, she stood beside the hull she'd been examining and looked at the sky above the Garden City Marine Yard. The gray November coastal sky, not dramatic, just the ordinary sky of a working day, and felt the specific quality of a piece of the architecture holding. Good, she said. Very good. A pause. How are you doing? It was not a case question. He had learned over 7 months to distinguish between the two. I'm good, she said. I'm at a yard in Garden City, and I'm going to finish this examination and drive home and make dinner and look at the river. She paused. Come to Savannah on Friday if you can. I can, he said. Good, she said again and went back to work. She finished the examination and drove home across the Talmadge Bridge with the November River below and the Savannah waterfront on the bluff and the particular evening light of late autumn on the Georgia coast. The quality that the city had in November that was different from its spring quality and its summer quality. Lower more considered the city in its working mode rather than its blooming mode. She liked the working mode. She had always worked best when the world was also working. She made dinner and sat on the Jones Street porch in the November air, which was cool enough now to make the porch a different experience than it had been in July, and looked at the garden below and thought about the case in its current state. The photographs admissible, the trial date set the evidence complete. 8 years of Tidewater Guarantee Group's operation, constructed through 4 iterations across multiple jurisdictions, built on the calculation that no one would look closely enough, finally arriving at the room where it would be examined fully. Vernon Sills had looked closely. He had looked at 65 feet of dark water and understood what he was seeing, and he had made 34 photographs and a handwritten binder and a phone call to his daughter, and all of it had survived. The trial was in February. February was not far. She went inside and slept with the Jones Street quiet around her and woke in the morning to work. The trial began on a Monday in February with the particular cold clarity that the Georgia coast produced in winter, not harsh cold, not the inland cold of a place that didn't have the ocean's moderating presence, but a clean, salt-edged chill that made everything look precise. Margaret drove down from Savannah on Sunday evening and checked into the same Brunswick hotel she had used for the witness preparation sessions, the one that was functional and clean and expected nothing from her except competent payment of the nightly rate. She was in the gallery for the first week. Daniel had arranged a seat in the section reserved for material witnesses and their counsel. She had a lawyer of her own now retained when she had formally entered witness status, a maritime law specialist from Savannah named Alec Grantham, who was 60 and had seen enough federal cases to be neither impressed nor alarmed by any aspect of hers. He sat beside her in the gallery for the first day and satisfied himself that she understood the situation and then left her to attend the proceedings without requiring supervision. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by the lead trial attorney, a woman named Cora Wills, who was the U.S. Attorney's point person on the case. Cora Wills was 45 compact and had the quality of someone who had tried a great deal of federal litigation and had learned that precision was more persuasive than drama. Her opening was 31 minutes long. It mentioned Vernon Sills' name in the second sentence and the last, and it described the wreck from 1857 and what it contained with the care of someone who understood that the case was not only about the fraud and the murder, but about what the fraud and the murder had been designed to accomplish. Margaret sat in the gallery and listened to the architecture of the case she had helped build being laid out for the jury, and she thought about Vernon Sills' handwriting in the binder. Adele was 3 rows ahead of her, with her 2 sisters, and her mother, all 4 of them wearing the particular composure of people who had been holding this weight for 10 months and were now present at the moment where the holding would count for something. The defense opening statements followed, each structured around its client's distance from the central decisions. Aldis's attorney argued that her client was an insurance executive with no involvement in the physical operations. The fraud structure, she said, was Gerald Hewitt's design, and Hewitt was now testifying for the prosecution because cooperation was more valuable to him than truth. Alva's attorney argued that the dive operation was legitimate salvage contracted through proper channels, and that any wrongdoing was on the part of the principals who hired her. Hewitt's attorney, per the cooperation agreement, offered no defense opening. It was good lawyering. Margaret had expected it to be good lawyering. It was not going to be enough. She had the specific certainty of someone who had read the complete evidence package and understood what it contained. But certainty from the gallery was not certainty from the jury box, and the jury had to get there by its own route. The first week was Cora Wills building the factual foundation, the corporate structure of Tidewater Guarantee Group, the insurance policies, the relationship between the reinsurance mechanism and the wreck site operation, the financial flows. Forensic accountants and corporate records analysts, and an expert witness in maritime insurance fraud who had been doing that specific work for 20 years. The jury was patient with the financial documentation and more engaged by the human pieces, the testimony of the Coast Guard incident officers who had investigated the 3 sinkings, the Thunderbolt Marina manager Oscar Belk, who described Vernon Sills' maintenance practices with the plain economy of a man who knew what he was talking about. On Thursday of the first week, Tommy Crest testified. He was on the stand for 2 hours, and he was exactly what Margaret had assessed him as at the Brunswick field office interview, plain factual without embellishment. He described being hired to transport work, the canister configuration, the sinking of the Amber Sound. He described the calm night in the pump he had known from 3 years of ownership, and the water coming in at a rate that was not consistent with any system failure he recognized. He described swimming to safety and watching his boat go down. Cross-examination tried to establish that he had a financial motive to testify. He had filed a civil claim against Coastal Meridian Marine Holdings after the federal prosecution began seeking recovery of the Amber Sound's value. His attorney had advised him correctly that the federal testimony was separate from the civil claim, and that the civil claim was not a motive for the federal testimony. He said that clearly. The cross-examination moved on. Della Price testified on Friday. She was 63, still working, had replaced the Della Blue with a slightly older vessel she was running under contract, while the civil case against the insurer worked its way through the system. She was on the stand for 90 minutes. Her description of the pump she had trusted for 12 years, and the condition she had maintained it in, and the night it had not held, was delivered with the flat certainty of a woman who was not going to be told what she knew about her own boat. Cross-examination of Della Price was briefer than the other witnesses. Alves's attorney found exactly one weakness in her testimony, a minor inconsistency in the timing between two events on the night of the sinking, and made what she could of it. Della Price looked at the attorney and said, "I was in the water. The exact time isn't what I was thinking about." The jury, Margaret noticed, was listening to Della Price the way people listen to someone who was telling the truth. She testified in the second week on a Wednesday. She had prepared for months. She had been over every aspect of her testimony with Petra and with Alec Grantham, and in her own careful review of the documentation she had produced. She walked to the stand with the organization that 11 years of professional precision had built into her posture and her manner, and she answered the first question's background credentials, methodology, with the economy of someone who had said these things before and had no need to perform them. Cora Wills walked her through the Leonora Blue examination, the 3 circuits before touching the hull, the engine room, the bilge system, the pump housing, the thread condition on the coupling bolt holes. Margaret described what she had seen in the same language she had used in the formal report, precise, clinical, the language of evidence. When Cora asked why she had called Daniel Frey before opening Vernon Sills' binder, Margaret said, "Because I had found physical evidence of a deliberate act, and the correct response to deliberate act evidence is to ensure it's handled in a way that makes it usable by the right people. I called the investigating attorney because that was the right call to make." When Cora asked why she had identified the Tidewater reinsurance pattern before being asked to, Margaret said, "Because it was there. I'd seen the name 3 times in 6 months on 3 policies connected to 3 sinkings. That's not a coincidence, that's a pattern. Identifying patterns is part of the methodology." "What is the methodology?" Cora asked. "Follow what the evidence shows you. Mark what you know and what you suspect, and keep those categories clearly separate. Don't stop looking because what you're finding is inconvenient." She paused. "Those principles produce accurate assessments. They also, in this case, produce the basis for a federal investigation." She was on the stand for 2.5 hours for the direct examination. Cross-examination came from Aldis's attorney, who was the most skilled of the 3 defense lawyers and who had clearly read Margaret's background thoroughly. The technical challenge came first, the thread condition analysis, her methodology for distinguishing deliberate removal from mechanical failure. She answered precisely. Her documentation was in the record. The comparative report on the 3 vessels was in the record. She referred the attorney to the specific sections. The conflict of interest challenge came next. She had anticipated it and had the answer organized. "I found the evidence before I had any contact with any federal authority. The evidence was the reason for the contact, not the other way around. The timestamp on my pump documentation photographs precedes my first communication with the investigating authority by approximately 4 hours. That sequence is in the record." The personal relationship challenge was the last, and it came at a specific angle she had prepared for, but which was still the most difficult. "Ms. Parrish, you have had a personal relationship with the lead investigating attorney on this case throughout the investigation period, have you not?" She looked at the attorney calmly. "I have a professional relationship with the lead investigating attorney. I worked with his office as a material witness throughout the investigation period. And in addition to that professional relationship, we have had social contact during the investigation period, dinner on several occasions." She did not qualify it further. "The evidence I produced was produced independently prior to or concurrent with the professional relationship, and its integrity is established by the documentary record, not by the relationship." "You've had dinner with the investigating attorney multiple times during the investigation." "Yes, and you maintain that relationship had no influence on your conclusions." "The conclusions preceded the relationship in the cases that matter most. The pump finding and the Tidewater pattern identification both occurred before I had any contact with Daniel Frey. The relationship that developed from that contact did not produce the evidence. The evidence produced the contact which produced the relationship." She held the attorney's gaze. "Those are the facts in the correct sequence." The attorney paused, then no further questions. She stepped down and walked back to the gallery and did not look at the prosecution table because that was not the moment, and both of them understood the reason without it needing to be said. Alec Grantham beside her in the gallery said quietly, "That was the best I've seen from a non-attorney witness in 15 years. I've had 11 years of practice," she said. Adele testified on Thursday of the second week. She had prepared with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything. She described her father's phone calls, the hiring by Hewitt, the confrontation, the call, the night before the Leonora Blue went out. She described the binder, her father's instruction to take it if anything happened the morning she had gone to the marina and taken it before anyone else arrived. The week she had spent with it in her hands, afraid to open it, certain it contained something that mattered. "Why were you afraid to open it?" Cora Wills asked. Adele was quiet for a moment. "Because once I knew what was in it, I had the same responsibility he had." She looked at the jury. "He found something he couldn't ignore. Once I had the binder, I had found it too. I didn't want to know that yet. And then Margaret Parrish called my office and said she had found something wrong with the pump, and I understood that the time for not knowing was over." "What did you do?" "I called her back in 40 minutes, Adele said, "and I asked her to come that day." Cross-examination of Adele was minimal. There was nothing in her testimony to effectively challenge it, was precise and human, and the kind of account that juries understood without needing to interpret. After in the corridor, Adele found Margaret, and they stood together in the way they had developed over 10 months of this, not requiring words for the difficult parts, letting the fact of the standing together be the thing. "He would have found the whole trial process very uncomfortable," Adele said. "He would have been wrong to," Margaret said. "I know," Adele almost smiled. "He was wrong sometimes. Careful doesn't mean infallible." "No." She looked in the corridor, the other people moving through. "He was right about the important things." "He was right about all of it," Margaret said. "Every decision in the last 3 months of his life was correct. That's a fact." Adele held that. "Yes," she said, "it is." The testimony that the gallery had been waiting for, the testimony that the descendant community representatives who had been in their seats every morning had been waiting for, came at the end of the second week. Josephine Baxter was called as an expert witness on the historical and cultural significance of the 1857 wreck and its contents. She had not been deposed and had not been cross-examined in preparation. Her testimony was a different category than the forensic witness's expert testimony on the meaning of the wreck rather than the mechanics of the fraud. She was on the stand for 3 hours. She described the 3-year advocacy effort to have the site formally protected. She described the research that had identified the wreck in its probable historical context. She described the community's documented connection to the people who had been on that vessel. She described the journal and the partial inscription and the 11-year genealogy effort that had produced, when combined with the forensic enhancement, the provisional identification of the inscription. "We say provisional," she said, "because we follow the evidence we have, and we mark what we know and what we believe, and we don't overclaim. The inscription identifies a person as Sable Port Royal 1857. We believe we know who that was. We can't yet prove it. The belief is specific, it's documented, and it's based on 11 years of careful research." She paused. "The objects taken from that wreck, the journal, the combs, the ceramic vessel, were not historical artifacts in the sense that term is usually used. They were the last material connections that a specific community has to specific people. They are proof that those people existed, that they had things they valued, that they carried them on a journey from which they did not return." "What does it mean," Cora Wills asked, "to have those connections removed and sold?" Josephine looked at the jury with the directness of someone who had been making this argument for 20 years and had not stopped believing in it. "It means the evidence of those people's lives is treated as a commodity. It means the proof that they existed is more valuable to the people who sold it than the truth of what it represents. It means that the communities who carry those lives forward in memory and genealogy and oral history are told once again that someone else's calculation of value outweighs their connection to their own history." She paused. "It is not a new story. It is a very old story. What is different this time is that the law said it was wrong." The courtroom was very quiet. The defense attorneys had the right to cross-examine. All 3 waived. Margaret sat in the gallery and looked at the jury, 12 people who had been listening to the case for 2 weeks and were now in possession of the full picture of what Tidewater Guarantee Group had done and why. And she thought about Vernon Sills on his boat at 65 feet of dark water, free diving with his phone in a waterproof case, understanding what he was looking at. He had understood. He had written it down. He had called it people's things. The jury was understanding it now. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On a Thursday afternoon in the third week of the trial, they returned. Carter Aldous guilty on all counts, including conspiracy to commit murder in the second degree in the death of Vernon Sills. Renata Alves guilty on 9 of 13 counts, including the 3 counts relating to the deliberate sinking of the Amber Sound, the Della Blue, and the Leonora Blue. Gerald Hewitt findings consistent with his cooperation agreement reduced charges, sentencing to be determined at a separate proceeding. Margaret was in the gallery when the verdicts were read. Adele was 2 rows ahead of her, as she had been every day of the trial with her sisters and her mother. The community representatives from Josephine's organization were in their seats on the far side of the gallery. When the Aldous verdict was read, specifically when the conspiracy to commit murder count was announced, the gallery did not react dramatically. There was a collective quality of breath of stillness, and then the particular held quality of people absorbing something that had been waited for. Adele did not move for a long moment. Then her older sister put her arm around her, and Adele allowed herself to be held, which was in 10 months of knowing Adele Sills the most human thing Margaret had seen her do. After, in the corridor, Adele came to Margaret with her composure fully restored the way Adele did things. The need met the reserve back in place, the forward motion resumed. He would have said, "Careful does it," Adele said. "Yes," Margaret said. He would have been right. He was right about most things that mattered. She looked at Margaret. "Thank you. Not for the outcomes specifically, you can't guarantee outcomes. For not looking away from what you found." "I couldn't look away from it," Margaret said. "It was wrong." "I know." Adele paused. "That's exactly what my father would have said." Margaret walked out of the Brunswick courthouse into the February afternoon. The coastal winter light was doing its particular thing, low and very clear, the kind of clarity that the season produced before the spring softening began. The bay was visible at the end of the street, flat and silver, doing what it always did. She called Daniel. He picked up on the first ring. "Verdict's read," she said. "I know, I was in the building." A pause. "All counts. All the important ones." "Yes." His voice had the quality she had learned to hear as the specific satisfaction of an outcome that had been built correctly, holding the way it was supposed to hold. "Where are you right now?" "Outside the courthouse, looking at the bay." "I'm coming out," he said. He came through the courthouse doors 3 minutes later. He was in the dark jacket she recognized from the first drive to Whitmarsh Island, the one that was for working and not performing in. He came down the courthouse steps and stood beside her and looked at the same bay. "It held," she said. "It held," he said. They stood there for a while in the February clear air, the bay doing its indifferent and continuous thing. The courthouse behind them, the city going about its business in the way cities did, regardless of what had been decided inside their federal buildings. "The island," she said. He looked at her. "What island?" "The one south of Savannah that takes 40 minutes by boat, where there's nothing to do except pay attention." She looked at the bay. "I made the offer in August, and you put it in the record." "I have the record," he said. "The case is resolved." "The case is resolved." He looked at her steadily. "When?" "Next weekend, if the weather holds." She paused. "Bring something warm. The coast in February has opinions about what you wear on it." He looked at the bay, and she looked at the bay, and the February light was doing what it did. "The weather will hold," he said. "You don't know that," she said. "No," he agreed, but I'd like it to." She went back to the hotel and packed and drove to Savannah on Thursday evening, the coastal Georgia highway in the winter dark, the marsh smell through the cracked window, the particular quality of driving home through a landscape you knew well. She had driven this road so many times in the past 10 months that the marsh lit by headlights had become a specific thing she recognized, not just any marsh, but this one, this particular stretch of the Georgia coast between Brunswick and Savannah. She went home and made dinner and sat on the Jones Street porch in the February cold and looked at the dark garden below and thought about what had just been decided and what it meant. Carter Aldous, who had built 4 iterations of the same operation and dismantled 3 of them without consequence, had encountered the 4th iteration. Vernon Sills had been the difference, the working man who looked at what was happening and understood it, and made 34 photographs and a handwritten binder and a call to his daughter. The evidence had survived because Vernon had planned for the possibility that he would not. It had survived, and it had held, and it had been enough. She called Josephine from the porch. "The verdicts," Josephine said before she could speak. "You heard." "My cousin called from the Brunswick courthouse." She was quiet for a moment. "The journal, the combs, the ceramic vessel, they're going to be returned to us." "Yes." All 9 voluntarily returned items, and the other 3 from the collectors who were contesting the subpoenas their attorneys filed this morning before the verdicts recommending their clients comply. "The guilty verdicts seal it." She paused. "We're going to have a ceremony, a receiving ceremony, For the community, not a public event, not performative, just the families and the researchers and the people who have been working toward this. That's exactly right, Margaret said. That's what it should be. Would you come? Josephine asked. You and Daniel Frey, not as officials, as people who were part of bringing it to this. Margaret looked at the dark garden. The Jones Street cat that sometimes appeared on the garden wall was there sitting in the cold with the indifferent composure of cats who had decided that weather was not something they acknowledged. Yes, she said, we'll be there. She ended the call and sat in the February cold with the garden below and thought about a wreck at 65 feet in a protected marine area being documented now by the proper archaeological team. Everything that was there being recorded and cataloged and treated as what it was. The material evidence of people's lives, the proof that they had existed and carried things they valued and made a journey. The evidence existed. Someone had made sure it was heard. The week between the verdicts and the sentencing hearing was the specific texture of aftermath, not the dramatic aftermath of fiction, but the practical one, the working through of what needed to happen next and in what order. Margaret drove to Savannah and spent 2 days at her Factors Walk office, catching up on the 3 cases she had been maintaining at half attention through the trial period, returning the careful focus they deserved now that the trial was not the first thing in the room. Her accountant called on Thursday. The Amber Sound civil claim, he said. The Coastal Meridian Affiliates Insurance Company has been in settlement discussions with Tommy Kress's attorney for the past week. Now that the criminal verdicts are in, I'm told an offer has been made. Good. It's a reasonable offer. Not everything he should get, but within range. A pause. Your professional engagement on the Leonora Blue Coastal Meridian's original insurer is revisiting their coverage liability position in light of the criminal findings. Their internal investigation found that the retainer they issued to you was generated through a process that was compromised by Tidewater's infiltration of their claims department. They're treating your work as having been done in good faith under a compromised engagement. Which it was. The upshot is that they're proposing a resolution of your fee status, and they're also separately, and not because I asked, but because they apparently understood it was the right move. They've sent a letter to their marine insurance industry contacts reaffirming your professional standing. He paused. That letter went out yesterday. Margaret looked at the river through her window. The February light was coming in at the low angle of late winter, the bent glass making it particular and specific. That was the right thing to do, she said. They're trying to be on the correct side of the history now that the history is visible. He said it with the practical neutrality of a man who understood corporate motivation without being naive about it. In this case, the correct side of the history is also the commercially useful side, which makes the decision easier for them. But the letter is real and the industry contacts are real, and your pipeline going forward is going to be healthier than it was before the Leonora Blue. I wasn't worried about that, she said. I know you weren't, he paused. That's why I handle the worrying on your behalf. She called Della Price that afternoon. Della was in Brunswick running her contracted vessel in the middle of a shrimping season that was going reasonably well. The verdicts came in while I was on the water, Della said. My daughter called me on the boat radio. A pause. I went back out the next morning like always. What else do you do? You go back out, Margaret said. 33 years on that water. My boat, the Della Blue, she was a good boat. I had her for 12 years. Her voice had the specific quality of someone who had lost a working tool they had known the way Margaret knew hull damage through accumulated presence, through the knowledge that came from being in a relationship with a thing for a long time. The civil case against the insurer is going to settle, my attorney says. I can get another boat, a newer one maybe. She paused. It's not the same. No, Margaret said, it's not. The women on that wreck, Della said. I've been thinking about them since the trial, since Josephine Baxter testified. She was quiet for a moment. I grew up hearing about this kind of thing. The Georgia Islands, the maritime history. My grandmother used to talk about the water like it held everything good and bad both. She used to say the water keeps what you put in it. She paused. She was right. The water kept Vernon Sills' photographs. The water kept a lot of things, Margaret said. The wreck itself, the contents. 65 feet down for 168 years. It keeps it until someone is ready to look. Della's voice was steady. That's the other part of what my grandmother used to say. The water keeps it, but you have to go looking. You have to go back. Margaret sat with that for a while after the call. You have to go back. Vernon Sills had gone back, not to the little Ogeechee dock, not to the work he'd been hired for, but to the coordinates, to the wreck, to the place where he had understood something was wrong and had gone back to document it correctly. She had gone back in her way, back to the engine room, back to the pump, back to the thread condition on the coupling bolt holes when the easy conclusion was available, and she had not taken it. Going back was the work. Going back was always the work. The sentencing hearing was 2 weeks after the verdicts. Carter Aldous received 24 years for the full conviction, including the conspiracy to commit murder count. Renata Alves received 11 years on the 9 guilty counts, with the diving certification permanently revoked. Gerald Hewitt, per the cooperation agreement, received 3 years with the possibility of parole at 18 months, and his cooperation would be a factor in the parole consideration. Margaret read the sentencing outcomes on her phone at her Factor's Walk desk and put the phone down and sat with the river outside her window. 24 years. That was the legal calculation for Vernon Sills' life, for the particular quality of a man who had spent 40 years on the water, who had kept his maintenance logs in handwriting that matched his pump inspection notes, who had written people's things twice in a binder that his daughter carried off a marina dock at 5 in the morning. 24 years was not the value of Vernon Sills' life. It was the maximum that the law could name. She called Adele. "I know," Adele said. "My phone hasn't stopped." "How are you?" "Processing." A pause. "The number feels—" She stopped. "There is no number that is right. That's not the law's fault. There is no number." Another pause. "He would have told me not to focus on the number. He would have said focus on what was right, not what feels like enough. Nothing will ever feel like enough." "No," Margaret said. "It won't. But the right things happened," Adele said. "The photographs were used, the binder was used, the site is protected, the items are being returned." She paused. "He got to the end of it. We just got there, on his behalf." "Yes," Margaret said. "That's exactly right. Are you going to the ceremony, the one Josephine is organizing?" "Yes, in April, when the first items are formally received back." She paused. "Your family should be there, Adele. Not because you're required to be, because your father understood what those items meant, and he made it possible for them to come home. The community should know that." Adele was quiet for a moment. "He would have been uncomfortable." "He would have been uncomfortable, and he would have gone anyway," Margaret said, "because it was the right thing to do." "Yes." She could hear the slight quality in Adele's voice that was the closest Adele came to a smile without it being visible. That was always him. The island south of Savannah. It was called Ossabaw Island, 40 minutes by boat from the landing at Skidaway, a state-protected barrier island that had no permanent residents and no commercial development, and had the quality of a place where the natural world had continued doing what it did without being significantly interrupted by human decisions in the recent century. They went on a Saturday in late February, after the sentencing, when the weather had done what Daniel had expressed a preference for it doing, and had produced a clear, mild coastal day of the specific quality that the Georgia Barrier Islands produced in the last days of winter. The cold fully lifted the spring, not yet established a day that was entirely its own thing and not a transition. Daniel met her at the Skidaway landing at 9 in the morning with the canvas jacket and the practical manner of someone who had been told to bring something warm and had taken the instructions seriously. She had a cooler with food and coffee in the truck, and they loaded the boat, a borrowed center console that she had been using for independent assessment work for 3 years and knew the handling of, and went south through the coastal waterway. The Georgia Barrier Islands from the water had a quality that was not available from the land. The marshes opened up differently from the water side. The tidal creeks, more visible in their complexity, the horizon line lower and more various. She ran the boat at a comfortable speed and pointed out the landmarks she knew from this stretch of the coast. And he looked at them with the attention she had come to expect from him, genuinely looking, not performing the performance of looking. They crossed the inlet to Ossabaw in the late morning, the Atlantic side of the island ahead of them, the beach long and empty and the January-fed dunes behind it still in their winter configuration. She beached the boat and they walked north along the shore, with the ocean on their left and the island behind them, and the February light doing what it did out here. No buildings, no competing structures, just the light and the water and the island. He was good at this, she discovered. Good at the island version of paying attention, the long-looking, the silence that was not awkward. The quality of being fully present in a place that asked for nothing except your presence. She had not been entirely certain he would be, because knowing someone from a conference room and a waterfront restaurant was a particular kind of knowing, and the island was a different context. He was good at it. They walked for an hour and sat on a dune and ate the lunch she had packed and drank coffee from the thermos and looked at the Atlantic doing what the Atlantic did, which was, as she had noted to herself at various points over the past 10 months, the thing that the Atlantic always did, regardless of what was happening on its margins. Continuous and different, enormous in the way of things that had been doing this since before the language had words for it. "I've been in federal maritime law enforcement for 16 years, he said at some point in the afternoon, and I've never spent time on the Georgia Barrier Islands. That's an oversight, a significant one." He looked at the ocean. "The work kept me offshore or in port, not between those two things." "The islands are between those two things," she said. "That's why they're their own thing." He looked at her. The afternoon light on the island was doing the thing she had wanted to show him. The low angle, the particular quality of reflection off the water. The way the barrier island light was different from the mainland light because there was so much more water around it. "This was exactly what you said it would be," he said. "I know the island," she said. "You know the island." He said it with the slight quality she had cataloged. "How long have you known it?" 3 years. A colleague told me about it in my first year in Savannah. I've been coming when I need to think." She looked at the ocean. "I've done a lot of my best thinking here." "What were you thinking about when you came here?" "Cases mostly, the specific kind that didn't resolve cleanly, where the evidence was pointing somewhere and I needed the distance to see where." She paused. "I came here twice during the Leonora Blue investigation. Once after I found the pump. Once after I found out about the prior iterations of the tidewater structure." "What did you decide those 2 times?" She looked at him. "The first time that following the evidence to its full end was the only thing I could do and stay the person I am." She paused. "The second time that what we were building was solid enough to hold. That the evidence was complete enough and the chain was clean enough and the people doing the work were the right people for it." He was quiet for a moment. The people, she said. "I had a strong opinion about the people by the second time I came here." He looked at her with the direct quality that was his register for things he was taking entirely seriously. "You're good at assessing people," he said. 11 years, and a particular methodology." He said it with the quality that she had at this point a very substantial file on. "What did the methodology tell you?" She looked at the Atlantic. "That the person I was working with operated by the same standard I operate by. That he followed evidence without flinching at where it went. That he called the right person at 5 in the morning because that was the right call to make first." She paused. "That he arrived organized and stayed organized under pressure, and that those 2 things are the ones you actually need from someone when the situation is difficult." He was quiet. The island did what islands do, which is to make the silence feel appropriate rather than empty. "I made the same assessment," he said. "The person I was working with." "I know," she said. "I could tell." The afternoon was moving into its later register, the light changing toward the specific color of the barrier island at 4 in the afternoon. In February, the last warmth of the day concentrating in the light before it went. They would need to leave within the hour to make the crossing before dark. Neither of them moved yet. "After this," he said, meaning after the island, meaning after the case, meaning the general question of what next. "After this," she said, meaning the same things. "I go back to Savannah and work my cases. You go back to Brunswick and work yours. We have dinner in Savannah when you're there, and occasionally dinner in Brunswick when I'm there, and we come to this island when the weather suits." "That's a plan," he said. "It's a plan that has the virtue of being what we're already doing," she said, "which makes it the kind of plan that has already proven itself." He looked at her. The light was doing its particular thing. "Yes," he said, "it has." They packed up and walked back to the boat, and she ran them home through the waterway in the last of the afternoon light, the Ossabaw Inlet crossing, and then the long run north through the coastal channels. The marsh doing its winter-ending version of itself, the light going gold, and then amber, and then the coastal dark coming in from the east the way it did out here, where there was nothing between you and the ocean to slow it down. She tied up at the Skidaway landing in the dark, and they drove back to Savannah in their separate trucks and met at the Jones Street apartment, which he had been to before, and which had the quality by now of a place he arrived at and was easy in. She made dinner and they ate on the porch in the February night, and talked about the island and the case and what came next, and the Jones Street cat appeared on the garden wall with its characteristic timing and sat in the dark watching them with the judgmental composure of a cat that had decided they were acceptable. Daniel looked at the cat. "Is that your cat?" "The garden's cat," she said. "It tolerates me." That seems like the right relationship with a garden cat. It seems like the only available one. She looked at the cat. It showed up in September. I've been feeding it, which has not produced affection, but has produced occasional presence. Occasional presence is underrated, he said. It is, she said. It's the thing that shows up consistently and can be counted on without requiring performance or announcement. She paused. I've come to value that in cats and people alike. He looked at her. In the Jones Street dark with the garden below and the Savannah night around them, and the case fully over and the island behind them, and the things they had each said clearly enough to be on the record, he looked at her with the quality that she had been filing for 10 months, and which she now simply recognized as the way he looked at her. I've been told I'm occasionally present, he said. You're reliably present when the situation requires it, she said, which is different and better. He considered that. I'll take it. The February night was mild enough to stay on the porch until 10, which they did, and then she went inside and he went home to the place he was staying in Savannah when he was in the city for work, which was not far. And she sat at the desk for a while before she went to bed and looked at the river through the bent glass and thought about the specific shape of the past 10 months. The Leonora Blue, the pump housing, the call to Daniel Frey before opening a binder she could not have known the contents of. The particular quality of arriving at a kitchen table and knowing before a word was said that the thing you had found was the beginning of something larger than itself. That was the job. You followed the evidence and you found the case, and the case led you to the people who were doing the work, and together you built something that held. And sometimes, not always, not as a calculation, but as what happened when the work was done, by people who operated by the same standard, you found something else alongside the case. She had found something else. The river outside the window moved the way the Savannah River always moved, wide and slow, and entirely itself carrying what it carried toward the sea. She turned off the lamp and went to bed and slept well. The spring came the way Georgia springs came, without apology, and with the specific quality of a season that had been accumulating in the marsh grass and the Spanish moss and the soil of the coastal islands for long enough that when it finally arrived, it arrived all at once, a decision the landscape made and then committed to fully. By March, the azaleas were in the live oaks were putting out their new growth over the old, and the Savannah River had the particular quality it had in spring, higher, with the increased runoff, darker in color, moving with slightly more authority than it did in the drier months. Margaret's Factor's walk office in March had the same bent glass window in the same river below it, and the same heart pine floor, and 3 new cases under contract, and 2 more in preliminary discussion, and a professional standing that had, as her accountant had predicted, improved measurably from the position she had been in when she walked into the Garden City Marine Yard and found a pump housing that didn't match its own story. She had been doing 11 years of work in the Low Country and Southeastern Maritime Corridor, and she had spent those 11 years building the specific reputation that the Leonora Blue case had tested and confirmed the woman who followed the evidence, who did not stop looking because the looking was inconvenient, who would come back with the truth regardless of who had hired her to come back with something else. She was choosier about clients now than she had been. She had always been professional in how she screened engagements. She was more deliberate now about the screening. Not because the Leonora Blue had made her cautious. Caution was not the lesson, but because it had clarified her understanding of what her work was for. She was not in the business of finding denial grounds. She was in the business of finding what was actually there. Those 2 things occasionally aligned. When they didn't, she was on one side of the line, and some clients were on the other, and she had learned to identify which kind of client she was dealing with before she took the work. It was solvable. It was always solvable. 11 years had taught her that the work existed for people who did it correctly, and that doing it correctly was the only way to keep doing it. She met Daniel twice in March, once in Savannah, and once in Brunswick, where she had been retained on an unrelated marine survey, and they had dinner both times at restaurants that had nothing to do with federal facilities. And once they went out on the boat through the coastal waterway on a Saturday afternoon, when the March weather was doing the thing it did at the turn of the season, still cool, but with the smell of the warming coming, the marsh grass just beginning its spring green at the roots. She had learned things about him in 10 months of working proximity, and the conversations that followed the work that he had been on the water since he was 7 years old, first in small sailboats off the outer banks of North Carolina, and then in progressively more serious maritime contexts through college and his years in the Coast Guard before law school. That he had stayed in the southeastern maritime law enforcement world, not because it was the path of least resistance he had had offers elsewhere, but because this was the corridor where the cases were most complex and where the stakes were most clearly connected to the specific layered histories of the coast. That he cooked badly but enthusiastically and had made dinner for her twice on evenings when she had been in Brunswick late enough that driving back to Savannah before 8 felt unreasonable. She had learned that he read with the same quality of attention he brought to everything else, and that the books on his shelves were the books of someone for whom the physical world and the historical world were equally real, which made sense for a person who spent his professional life at the intersection of ocean law and history. She had learned that he woke before 5 without an alarm and used the early hours for the work that required the most concentration, and that this habit had produced over 16 years of federal law enforcement, a body of work that was measured and precise and built correctly, the kind of work that held when it was tested. She had been testing the quality of his work in court documents and federal evidence packages for 10 months, and it held. The receiving ceremony Josephine Baxter had organized happened on a Saturday in April at the community center in Darien, where Margaret had met with Josephine and the research team the previous summer. The day was the specific quality of Georgia coastal. April warm and generous, the marsh grasses in their full spring expression, the azaleas in the island county completely committed to the season. The ceremony was not large. It was not meant to be. The families who were connected to the documented community from the 1857 vessel families, who had been maintaining that connection through oral history and genealogy and cultural practice for generations, were there, perhaps 60 people in total, in the space that was the right size for the thing it was doing. Josephine's research team, the archaeology team from the Federal Survey, representatives from the Georgia DNR, Margaret and Daniel, who had been invited not as officials, but as people who had been part of bringing it to this. Adele Sills and her sisters were there. Margaret had called Josephine in February to ask if they should be, and Josephine had said, "Of course. Your father understood what he was looking at. The community should know that." The items were brought in one by one. Not dramatically, no theatrical staging, no performance of significance. They were simply carried in and placed on the table that had been prepared, and the community gathered around them, and Josephine spoke about each one, what was known about where it came from, what the genealogical research suggested about whose it had been, what it meant to have it here. The journal, the combs and hairpins, the ceramic vessel with the gullah maker's mark, shoes in a child's size that had been on someone's feet on a vessel in 1857, going somewhere on a journey that had ended in 65 feet of coastal Georgia water. When Josephine finished speaking, there was a period of silence that was not awkward, the right kind of silence, the one that acknowledged the weight of what was in the room without trying to fill the weight with words. Then the families gathered, and the specific conversations that belonged to them happened in the spaces that were theirs, and Margaret stood at the edge of the room with Daniel beside her and felt the particular quality of being present at something that was not her story, but that she had been part of making possible. Adele came to her after with her sisters behind her. "My father would have found it overwhelming," Adele said. "He was not good with being in rooms where things mattered this much." "He was good with doing things that mattered," Margaret said. "He could have left the ceremony to other people." "He always left the ceremony to other people," Adele said. "He showed up for the work." She looked at the table with the items. "This is the work's outcome. He'd accept that." She paused. "His boat is going to the Thunderbolt Marina Heritage Pier in June. Oscar Belk confirmed last week." "Good," Margaret said. "That's exactly right." "It is." Adele looked at her. "What you said to me months ago in my kitchen about how my father got every decision right. I've been thinking about that a lot." She paused. "I think you were right. I also think there was a version of him that would have argued with you. He would have said he should have gotten out sooner. He would have said he should never have taken the Hewitt work in the first place." "He had no way to know what it was when he took it," Margaret said. "I know, but that wouldn't have stopped him from the argument." She almost smiled. "He was not easy on himself." "The careful ones never are," Margaret said. After the ceremony, Margaret and Daniel drove south along the coastal highway towards Savannah. In the April afternoon, the windows down the marsh doing its spring thing on either side of the road. She was driving. He was in the passenger seat in the posture she had come to know as his relaxed posture, organized but not alert the difference between a person at ease and a person performing ease. "The journal," she said, "the inscription identification. Josephine's team presented the full case to the genealogy board last month," he said. The provisional identification has been upgraded to probable. The descendant line they documented connects to the Port Royal community records from that period. He paused. It's not the same as certain, but it's probable in a way that the community is treating as real. Real enough, she said. Real enough. He looked at the marsh. Josephine said something to me before the ceremony. She said we don't stop working with the incomplete record. We work with what we have and we mark what we know and what we believe, and we don't overclaim. She said that's the only way to be honest about a history that was deliberately obscured. Margaret thought about that methodology, the same discipline she brought to hull examination applied to a completely different kind of evidence. Mark what you know and what you suspect. Keep the categories separate until the evidence collapses them. Work with what you have. She's doing the same work, Margaret said. Different material, same approach. Yes. He looked at her. You recognized that immediately when you met her. I recognized the methodology. And then you recognized the person. She looked at the road. Yes, she said. And then the person. The afternoon was long in the April way of afternoons that had just acquired an extra hour of daylight and were using it. They were back in Savannah by 5, the Factors Walk office building, visible as they crossed the Talmadge, the river wide below the bridge, in its spring-high state, moving with the authority of a river that knew where it was going. She parked on River Street, and they walked up the Factors Walk steps to the bluff level and stood at the railing above the river, the way she had stood on the second day of the investigation, 10 months in what felt like a very different life ago. The river carries everything, Daniel said. She looked at him. He was looking at the water. Vernon's daughter, he said. Della Price's account of what her grandmother told her. The water keeps what you put in it. He paused. The wreck from 1857. Vernon's photographs. The binder. The whole chain of evidence from the waterproof case on the Leonora Blues wheelhouse floor. He looked at the river. Everything that came back, it came back because it was kept. And because someone went looking, she said. And because someone went looking. He turned from the river to look at her. Vernon went looking. You went looking. Adele watched the driveway and made a phone call. He paused. Everyone in that chain made a specific decision to go back rather than away from it. Yes, she said. That's the pattern. It's the only pattern that produces anything that holds, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The river moved below them, carrying what it carried the Savannah evening, coming in over the water, with the specific quality of a coastal city's spring evening, warm in particular, and layered with everything that was always there and newly visible again. Margaret, he said. Yes. I'm thinking about relocating to Savannah. She looked at him. He met her eyes with the quality that she had been building a file on for 10 months, and which she was now entirely familiar with. The direct quality, the organized quality, the quality of a person saying a real thing and not performing the saying of it. The Brunswick sector office has been looking for a field deputy in Savannah for 2 years, he said. I've been the obvious candidate, and I've been not avoiding it, but not pursuing it either. The case gave me a reason to be in Savannah regularly, and I use that as sufficient. He paused. The case is over. The reason is still here. She looked at the river. She thought about the Factors Walk office 2 flights up, and the Jones Street apartment with the Jones Street cat, and the porch overlooking the garden and the island south of Savannah 40 minutes by boat, and the bent glass in the old windows that made everything look slightly more honest than it was. She thought about Daniel Frey, who had been in Savannah regularly for 10 months, and who she had come to understand not required prompting to be fully present when he was there. Who arrived organized and stayed organized. Who called the right people first. The field deputy position, she said, you'd be based here. Yes? The Brunswick work would still be part of it. Most of my work is in this corridor, regardless of where I'm based. The specific address changes. The work doesn't. He looked at her. I'd like the specific address to be Savannah. For the work, she said. For several reasons, he said, of which the work is one. She looked at the river for a long moment. The evening light on the water had the quality that the Savannah River had in late April. The long golden angle of a sun that was finally properly warm again. The water moving with the ease of a river that was exactly where it was supposed to be. I think Savannah is the right city for you, she said. I've thought so for a while, he said. So have I. He looked at the river. She looked at the river. The Savannah evening was doing what it always did, which was to arrange itself into the particular quality that made people who lived here understand why they stayed. The island, she said, in May when the weather warms enough to swim. I don't swim in the Atlantic in February, he said. It's not February in May. I know when May is. The slight quality. I'll bring the right gear. You always bring the right gear, she said. They walked back to Factor's Walk and up the stairs to her office where she had work she needed to finish before Monday, and he had a call to make about the sentencing documentation in a case she wasn't part of. And they worked in the same room without either of them requiring more than the occasional exchange that the shared space produced. This was, she had learned, one of the specific competencies they had in common, the ability to work in proximity without the proximity becoming a demand. At 7 o'clock, she put her files in order, and he finished his call, and she locked the office, and they walked down to the river level and found dinner at the working waterfront restaurant where the light came in from the east side of the river. And the menu was the local fish menu of a place that had been doing this long enough not to be trying to be anything else. She thought about what he had said relocating to Savannah, the field deputy position, several reasons of which the work is one. She had a very substantial file at this point, and the file had a clear conclusion, and she was the kind of person who followed her methodology to its conclusion when the evidence was solid. The evidence was solid. After dinner, they walked along the riverfront in the April dark, the water moving below the bluff, the city behind them doing what the city did at this hour. Not quiet, but at its own frequency, the particular low hum of a place that was never entirely still. She knew this walk the way she knew the hull of the Leonora Blue, from accumulated presence, from the specific knowledge that came from being in a relationship with a place long enough to know it without thinking. She had been in a relationship with Savannah for 7 years, and it had kept her the way cities kept the people they were right for, gradually and without announcement, until the question was not whether she belonged here, but simply whether she was paying attention to what the city was showing her. She had been paying attention. The receiving ceremony in Darien was the beginning of a longer process that Josephine Baxter and the community organizations managed over the following 2 years, the documentation and formal homecoming of each recovered item, the genealogical research that continued to build the connection between the 1857 vessel and the living families, the slow and careful work of returning the material evidence of people's lives to the people who had inherited those lives. The journal inscription Sable Port Royal, 1857, was formally identified in the second year. The probable identification became established when the community genealogy team, working with archival materials from the Port Royal Sound region, found a household register from a plantation that had been active in the 1850s. The register listed in the category that the document's author used for the people who worked the land and made the crops and built the buildings, a woman named Sable described as belonging to the Port Royal district. The entry was from 1855. There was no subsequent entry. The identification was published in a peer-reviewed journal of American maritime history in the third year with full attribution to the community genealogy team. It was the first peer-reviewed documentation of a specific individual connected to the wreck site. Josephine called Margaret the morning the publication was confirmed. "We know her name," she said. "Yes," Margaret said. "Now you do." Bahid. Carter Aldous appealed the sentence. The appeal was denied in the second year. Renata Alves served her sentence at a federal facility in Tallahassee. Her application for early release at the 40% mark was denied. Gerald Hewitt completed his sentence and, according to the Maritime Community Network that Margaret maintained, moved to a landlocked state and left the maritime sector entirely. Yeah. The Leonora Blue was towed from the Garden City Marine Yard to the Thunderbolt Marina Heritage Pier on a Wednesday in June, 3 months after the sentencing. Oscar Belk organized the berthing. He had restored the wheel and the cleats in the basic working configuration of the boat, not to museum condition, but to the condition of a vessel that was itself. Adele was there with her sisters. Tommy Crest drove up from Darien. Della Price came from Brunswick. A dozen people from the coastal shrimping and oyster communities who had known Vernon Sills or known of him. Oscar Belk, who had been the harbor master's equivalent for this marina for 14 years, and who had the specific patient quality of a man who had seen everything and maintained his standards regardless. The Leonora Blue was tied up at the Heritage Pier with a small placard, "Leonora Blue, Thunderbolt Marina, 1994 to 2025. Captain Vernon Sills." No other text. The boat was the argument. Adele stood at the pier for a long time after the others had moved to the dockhouse for the gathering that Oscar had organized, coffee and the specific boat launch food of the working waterfront. Margaret stood with her. "He would have said it was too much fuss," Adele said. "He would have been wrong," Margaret said. "He was wrong sometimes," Adele said. "The important times he was right." Adele looked at the Leonora Blue on the still water of the marina in the June morning. "She looks like she's home," she said. "She is," Margaret said. In September of the second year, Margaret expanded her Broad Street Factor's walk office to include a second appraiser. Her name was Vivian Chu, 31 years old, 4 years out of a naval architecture program, and 2 years of independent appraisal work in the Gulf Coast corridor. She had the methodology. The practice grew to serve the southeastern maritime corridor more systematically than Margaret had done as a solo practitioner. The cases were the cases she had always taken, the ones where the evidence pointed somewhere uncomfortable, where the right resolution and the easy resolution were not the same thing. Vivian asked her on her third week, "How do you know which cases to take?" "You read what the client is actually asking for," Margaret said. "They tell you if you listen. Some clients want the truth. Some clients want a specific finding. The ones who want the truth, those are your cases. And the ones who want a specific finding, you tell them politely that you find what you find and they should hire someone else." Vivian looked at her. "Is that as simple as it sounds?" "It's as simple as it sounds, and it costs you work early in the career before your reputation is established. After the reputation is established, the right clients come to you." Margaret paused. "Build the reputation by doing the work correctly. Everything else follows from that." Daniel Frey relocated to Savannah in September of the first year, which was 6 months after the trial, and 7 months after the island, and 4 months after he had said, "I'm thinking about relocating to Savannah." He had not said it to be strategic about it. He had said it because it was what he intended, and he saw no reason not to be direct about his intentions. He found an apartment in the Thomas Square neighborhood, which was a 15-minute walk from Factors Walk and a 20-minute walk from Jones Street. He was not in either place every day. He was reliably available when the situation required, which Margaret had told him on the island was the thing she valued most, and which he had continued to be across the following months. He had been right about the southeastern corridor. Most of his casework was in this geography, regardless of his official base location, and the Savannah field deputy position gave him a formal operational home that matched where the work actually happened. The Brunswick sector remained his jurisdictional responsibility, and he was there regularly. He was in Savannah regularly. The two things were compatible. Margaret had known they would be compatible. She had assessed the compatibility from the available evidence and found it solid. She was rarely wrong about solid. In the third year, the Georgia DNR archaeology team published their preliminary survey of the 1857 wreck site. The publication documented the wreck's structural condition, the identified contents of the cargo hold and passenger areas, the evidence of Tidewater Guarantee Group's extraction activity, and the scope of what remained. The publication used photographs from the survey and from Vernon Sills' waterproof camera. His photographs were credited as documentation by Captain Vernon Sills, March 2025. His name in the published record. Adele bought 6 copies of the publication. She kept one for herself, gave one to each of her sisters, and brought one to the Leonora Blue at the Thunderbolt Heritage Pier. She placed it inside the wheelhouse on the shelf where the maintenance binder had once been. She called Margaret that evening. "His name is in the record," she said. "Yes," Margaret said, "it is." "He was always meticulous about records," Adele said. "He would have appreciated that part." "He would have appreciated that it was the right kind of record," Margaret said. "Not a monument, the actual evidence." "Yes," a pause, "the actual evidence." Margaret stood at her Factors Walk window on a Friday morning in October of the third year. The river below was the October version of itself, darker and more considered than in summer, the light coming in at a lower angle across the width of it, the far bank of the river in its autumn version. She had been in this office for 7 years now. The bent glass in the windows had not changed. The heart pine floor had not changed. The river outside had not changed in any essential way, though she had watched it through 3 years of seasons and could now distinguish its character in each one. She had a case on her desk, a disputed hull loss claim out of Fernandina Beach, a commercial fishing vessel, the preliminary documentation suggesting the kind of anomaly she was good at identifying. She was going down to Fernandina Beach on Monday to look at the hull. She would do 3 circuits before she touched it. She was good at this. She had been good at it before the Leonora Blue, and she was better at it after because the Leonora Blue had not changed the methodology, but had clarified its purpose. It had made specific again what 11 years of professional distance had occasionally let go blurry, that the work was not about finding the right answer for the client. It was about finding the answer that was actually there. The answer that was actually there was the only thing worth finding. Her phone rang. "Daniel, I'll be late tonight," he said. "The Brunswick call ran long. I'm looking at 9 o'clock. "I'll save dinner," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked at the river. "I'll save dinner." A pause that had the quality she recognized as his version of acknowledgement, not elaborate, just present. Okay. Come when you get here, she said. I always do, he said. She put the phone down and looked at the river for a while. The October light on the water had a specific quality that she had not been able to see from this window. In her first year here, she had seen the river. She had not known the light well enough to read its October particular. Now she knew it. 3 years of mornings at this window. You learned places the way you learned anything that mattered through accumulated presence, through looking at the same thing long enough that the variations became visible, the specific quality of each season apparent against the background of all the others, through paying attention until the thing became yours, not in the sense of ownership, but in the sense of knowledge, the knowledge that came from being in a relationship with something long enough to understand it. She knew the river. She knew the Factor's walk staircase and the bent glass and the heart pine floor. She knew the Jones Street porch and the garden cat who had continued to appear on the wall with the regularity of a cat that had decided this garden was its territory and that occasional presence was the appropriate relationship to maintain. She knew the Ossabaw Island light in February and May. She knew the Skidaway landing in early morning and the coastal waterway in all its seasonal variations. She knew the specific quality of attention that Daniel Frey brought to every room he walked into, in every case he worked, in every conversation he had, and she had been building the file on that quality for 3 years, and the file was substantial and fully confirmed. She knew what the river carried. She had been paying attention to what the river carried home. Some things were lost. That was true, and she had no pretension otherwise. The items that Tidewater Guarantee Group had sold into the private market, and that had not been recovered through the subpoenas, were gone into collections whose owners had either not been identified or had successfully fought the return. 14 items, and the law had gotten 9 of them back. 14 items was not all of them, and all of them had never been a realistic possibility, and the 9 were real and were home. Some things came back. The ones that came back because someone had gone looking, and someone else had built the chain correctly, and someone else had held the binder and watched the driveway, and someone else had sealed the camera in a waterproof case and planned for the possibility that the plan might not work. The evidence survived because people had made specific decisions about what they could not walk away from. Margaret looked at the river. The morning was doing what October mornings on the Savannah waterfront did, the light finding the water at a low angle, and the river carrying everything in the specific, unhurried way of rivers that had been doing this since before the language had words for it. She turned back to the case file on her desk. Monday, she would drive to Fernandina Beach and look at a hull that had a story to tell, and she would walk around it 3 times before she touched it, and she would find what was there. That was the job. It had always been the job. The river moved. She went back to work. 3 years after the trial, Carter Aldis's appeal denied, Renata Alves completing her sentence. The Leonora Blue Heritage Pier, Thunderbolt Marina. The Journal of Sable Port Royal 1857, held by the descendant community under appropriate conditions as part of the living record. The wreck site formally protected under ongoing archaeological documentation, the survey expected to continue for 5 additional years. Josephine Baxter's organization expanded by 2 researchers continuing. Adele Sills teaching 2nd grade, occasionally joining Margaret for walks on the Whitmarsh Island Causeway at low tide. The Savannah River carrying what it carried the way it always had. The Factor's walk office, the bent glass, the heart pine floor, the view of the river. The work, always the work, and the specific quality of a life built from following what you found all the way to where it led. Not because it was easy, not because it was safe, but because it was the only thing you could do and stay yourself. That was the argument. The river made it every morning. Margaret Parrish had been listening for 7 years, and she intended to keep listening. -E. There was one more thing, and it came in a way she had not anticipated. On a Wednesday in November of the 3rd year, a letter arrived at the Factor's Walk office physical mail, which was unusual, the return address a law firm in Atlanta that she recognized as a cultural property restitution practice. The letter was from a collector named Eleanor Vance, who was 67 years old and lived in Charleston, South Carolina, and who had been one of the 9 voluntary returnees during the Tidewater investigation. She had not been one of the 2 who called Josephine directly. She had returned the item through her attorney with minimal communication. The item she had returned was one of the combs, a single ivory comb with a particular carving on the handle, a vine pattern that the Gullah cultural heritage consultant on Josephine's team had noted was consistent with low-country decorative motifs of the period. Eleanor Vance's letter said, "I have been sitting with what I did and what I should have done for 2 years. The appropriate restitution was completed through the legal process, and I understand that the comb is now with the community where it belongs. What I am writing to you about is something different. I acquired the comb in 2022 from a private dealer who represented it as legitimate salvage from an unspecified mid-Atlantic site. I did not ask questions that would have produced inconvenient answers because I wanted the piece and the story it came with was plausible enough. That is the truth of what I did, and I have been honest with myself about it. What I want to say and cannot say through an attorney's letter is this: I am a historian. I know what careful documentation looks like. I know what it costs to build a record that tells the truth about a history that was deliberately obscured. I read the archaeology team's preliminary publication, and I read the citation to Captain Vernon Sills' photographs. I read the account of how the investigation began. I want you to know that I understand what was done and what was undone, and I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my professional work making sure the kind of people who created the market for that comb cannot continue to find a market. I do not expect absolution. I am not writing to ask for it. I am writing because you were part of a chain of people who did the work correctly, and I believe the people in that chain deserve to know that the work extended further than they could see from where they were standing. The comb is home. What belongs to Sable belongs to Sable's people. That is all that matters. Eleanor Vance. Margaret read the letter twice. She set it on the desk. She looked at the river. She called Josephine. I know her name, Josephine said when Margaret had read the letter aloud. She didn't call me directly. I'd wondered about her. She's a historian. She knew what she was looking at. Yes. A pause. She knew and she didn't ask the questions. And then she knew and she couldn't unknow it. No, Margaret said. Once you know something like that, you can't. That's the test of who you are, Josephine said. What you can't unknow. She was quiet for a moment. My grandmother used to say that the truth has a weight and you can try to put it down, but it stays close to you, and eventually you have to decide whether to carry it properly or keep dropping it. She paused. Eleanor Vance decided to carry it properly. Belatedly, Margaret said. Yes, but she decided. Josephine was quiet again. Tell her the comb is home. If she wants to know what the community is doing with it, not to participate, just to know, I'll tell her. That's the most I can offer, and it's honest. Margaret wrote a response to Eleanor Vance. It was brief and it was factual. It said the comb is home. If you want to know how the community is caring for it, Josephine Baxter is the right person to contact. Her information is below. She sent the letter. That evening on the Jones Street porch in the November dark, she told Daniel about the letter. He listened without interrupting in the way he always listened. What do you make of it? She said. I think Eleanor Vance is doing the hardest work, he said. The work that comes after you've already made the mistake. The work of being honest about it and then doing something with the honesty rather than just carrying it. Not absolution, Margaret said. No, not absolution, just the honest accounting of what happened and the decision to make it part of what you do going forward. He looked at the garden below the porch. That's all any of us can do, really. When we find something we got wrong, do the honest accounting and make different decisions. She thought about Patricia Holt in the ST-67 case they'd heard about through the Coastal Legal Network. Not her case, a Charleston case, but similar territory. She thought about the chain of people who had found the wrong thing and not known it and had had to reckon with that. She thought about Eleanor Vance, 67 years old, writing a letter to a person she did not know because the weight of the truth required it. The truth had a weight. You could try to put it down, but it stayed close to you. Vernon carried it all the way, she said. He did, Daniel said. Every step, no putting it down. That's who he was. Yes, he looked at the garden. The careful ones always do. She looked at the garden. The November cat was on the wall as it was most evenings by now, having decided some months ago that the presence relationship was sustainable and worth maintaining. It was a cat of consistent judgment. She respected that. The November air was the specific quality of the Georgia coastal autumn at its end. The warmth mostly gone, a different kind of clarity coming in its place. The live oaks still in their green and everything else committing to the seasonal change. She thought about the work on her desk. The Fernandina Beach hull examined and reported. 3 more cases in active investigation. Vivian at the second desk handling the cases that were straightforward by the standards of what this office now took. The methodology living in 2 practitioners instead of 1. She thought about the river, what it carried home. Come inside, she said. It's cold. It's not that cold, Daniel said. It's going to get colder, she said. Come inside. He came inside. The Jones Street apartment had the quality of a place where two people had spent enough time to leave the specific evidence of their presence in the arrangement of things. The books on the shared shelf that were not both hers, the jacket on the hook by the door, the mug that was the shape he preferred when he was working in the morning. Evidence that accumulated without announcement, the way all evidence accumulated when you were paying attention to the right things. The river outside was doing what it always did. She had been paying attention for 3 years now, and she intended to keep paying attention, which was in the end the only practice that mattered. The work, the river, what the river carried home.